Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 2 o'clock and time for me to open this session of the Enfield Local Plan Examination. I'm Stephen Lee, the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the plan and report to the Council in due course. Can everybody hear me okay in the back there? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Can't see them. Has everybody been here before? No, I know there are some people who haven't. So I will go through a little bit about the format and approach being taken. I won't give the full spiel, as that would take too long. But as I went through, sorry, I should first say, before we move on too far, a little bit of housekeeping. If people could make sure their mobile phones, laptops and other devices are silent. We'll ask, we're not expecting any fire alarms or tests today, but if, just to cut things short, if one sounds, it will be a real one, and we should run after the council, is what I always think. If, wherever they go, we follow. That's the simplest way of looking at it. Refreshments are provided, I understand, and will be in the breaks. And if there are any issues around any of the organisational matters or procedural matters, then Annette Feeney, the programme officer, is available to help you. So that's the purpose and format of today's session. As I went through my long opening comments on day one, which set out in my role in full and that of the programme officer, I don't intend to go through this again. However, for those who've not been here before, it will just set out what the procedures are, how it works, and if you any concerns or questions, you can ask me about them. A reminder that the purpose of the examination is to help me decide if the plan, Enfield Local Plan submitted in August 2024, is legally compliant and sound, and if not, how it could be modified to ensure that it is. This session, like the others in the examination, will take the form of a structured discussion of the matters set out on the agenda that was published last week, and this afternoon we're dealing with part of Matter 4, and in particular sites RUR 06208. As per previous sessions, I'll start each agenda item with some questions to the Council. And when I've heard this response to those, I shall invite contributions from others. Sometimes, in order for me to keep things moving, I've got quite a few questions, so I would ask there's some patience while I get through everything I need to. Those who've been here before nodding, think yes, you've got a lot of questions. But there's some patience required while I get through everything I need to, and then when I open it up. When you wish to speak, turn your nameplate on its end and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. When I invite you to speak, please say who you are, and if appropriate, you represent, if the first time, you don't need to do that every single time, clearly. But please focus your comments on my questions or specific points made by others. I would also ask each contribution to be as concise and focused as possible to allow everyone a chance to speak if they wish to on a particular issue. And I think we have got quite an intense session, and I think we will be running till 5:30. We'll see where we are. I said 5:30. We'll see where we are, but hopefully we can get done. Please remember there's no need to simply repeat or summarise what you wrote in your representations or hearing statements. Similarly, there's no need to tell me if you agree with somebody or else or echo their comments or anything like that. And just a rule of thumb for me is that I don't tend to accept sort of written statements, reading out written statements, as they tend to not focus on what the questions are, the issues, and take quite a long time. So if you can sort of avoid reading statements out, that would be appreciated. Usually at the end of each point or each part of the agenda, I'll give the Council a chance to sum up their position or see if there's anything else to say before moving on. As with other sessions, if I identify that main modifications are required or that further work needs to be carried out by the Council or indeed others, I usually try to make that clear. And the Council are keeping a note of all such matters which we discussed yesterday, and they'll be issuing me with that at the end of each week, and I can add to it, take off whatever need to, and then that will be agreed. There may obviously be issues where I need longer to think about the points that have been raised and reflect on them, and then in which case I will deal with those in a later note rather than any action points that are identified. In terms of today's session, we're starting now. We'll try and have an adjournment at around 3:30 for around 20 minutes, and I say try and finish at 5:30. No, hopefully no later than that, but it's quite a lot to get through. We have got an overspill day, but we tend to see where we are by the end of the day and see if we can get it done. Are there any questions about any of that for anyone? No, thank you. So what we'll do, we'll start off before we get into the questions. I'm assuming there's no matters arising from this morning.
No, there aren't. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll do introductions first, and then I've got before we get into, I'm going to start with Whitewebbs. I know there's a couple of people talking about the other sites, but majority of it saw Whitewebbs, so I'm going to try and deal with that first. I've got one other point I want to raise with the council before we get into that. It's a matter of clarification. I apologise a little bit out of the blue, but I just want to check something, and then we'll crack on with Whitewebbs. So if we start with introductions, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Matthew Reid. I'm King's Counsel representing the council. With me is Mr. Dale Harris, who sits behind me as junior counsel.
And I'm Edward Jones. I'm Special Planning Manager here at Enfield Council.
Samuel Wong, Principal Planning Officer at Enfield Council.
Good afternoon, James Boylan from Quod, Planning Consultant on behalf of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club.
Sean Wilkinson from Friends of Whitewebbs, also representing today Enfield Road Watch.
Councillor Rees Fox, Councillor for Whitewebbs Ward.
I'm Andrew Lack, and I'm here this afternoon representing the Enfield Society.
Claire Martin, Head of Planning at Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, and I have my colleague Marigold Wilberforce, Head of Property. Thank you.
All very welcome, thank you. Right, so the agenda sets out Whitewebbs first, but I've just got one point with the council, if I may, and this goes back to matter stage one. And it was a question I asked in my stage one MIQs, because we're dealing with greenbelt sites which are not leading to any removal of land from the greenbelt today. So it was a point I raised in relation to the policies map in stage one MIQs, and in particular URB 06. And I didn't get round to asking about it at the time because of the time crunch we were in, and we didn't get into the policies map. And I think the way that I asked the question probably wasn't as clear as in hindsight. I asked the question, URB 06, I made the point in my MIQs that the site appears to be, the policy map appears to be in the green belt. Is that accurate? The answer came back and said, yes, it is accurate. Now, what I didn't then take that on and say, okay, so what does that mean then? Because if the policy map is accurate. So I just wanted to clarify, it's been bothering me, is URB 6, and we'll be coming on to the site, so I could clarify that, but so is URB 6 in the green belt, and therefore it's an allocation for housing where you're not seeking to remove land from the green belt?
So, yes,
yeah.
I've got the yeses, I've got the question, and I'll, if I may, check through that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to answer that question at this stage. I can certainly attempt to do so, but it's probably going to be more efficient if I
think it's just, it's just because I'm dealing with greenbelt, and it's troubled me from day, and for some reason I asked that question in hope to get clarification. I think because we didn't just get onto that issue,
yes.
It sort of slipped through my net. So I thought, as well, I was dealing with these other greenbelt sites. I just wanted to make sure. I think my assumption was, frankly, that it probably was an error on the policies map. It shouldn't be in the green belt, and it was not in the green belt. But then, the more I've looked at some of the evidence since, no, it does appear to be in the green belt. So I just wanted to, because there's nothing obviously in any of the blur, because even the policy doesn't mention the fact it's in the green belt. So it's a bit confusing.
Yeah, quite so.
Yeah. So yeah,
fully understood, and we'll make sure that you have an answer to it.
Okay, thank you. Right, so sorry about that. I was slightly out of the blue. Apologies, but so we're going to move on then to RUR07 Whitewebbs. Now, my questions and my MIQs were split into sort of two broad categories, starting with matters around Greenbelt, and then moving on to matters, if you like, about more normal sort of stuff about, is it a suitable location for development in general terms, what are the development requirements, and so on. So I'm going to split those into two parts. I'm going to start with the matters, the Greenbelt questions, which I think were sort of 4.71 to 4.74 broadly, and then start looking at the more non-Greenbelt specific issues about location, the development requirements, the modifications. So I'll open it up. In between those points. For those who are here to talk about Sloeman's Farm and Pickets Lock, some of my Greenbelt questions are quite generic and would apply to those sites as well. So don't feel if I pick up something that's a matter of principle, rather than you by all means raise your point there rather than me having to ask the question again in relation to those sites. I'm going to because I think some things like, for example, and it's a point I did raise in the assessment, is it appropriate to be allocating sites in the Greenbelt for these types of uses principle, that might apply to everything. So I don't feel we have to wait until I ask it again when I come to your site. And it means, obviously, you're also not necessarily sat there for an hour without much to say. So that's okay with everyone. The other point I want to make about Whitewebbs, and I'm just going to call it Whitewebbs rather than go through the entire title every time, is that I do note from the evidence that there's an application in with a resolution to grant permission. For all I know, that may have already, well, no, we have permission. I wanted to be very clear, and I've heard some of this at stage one anyway, so I'm aware of some of those issues, but I want to make it clear that I'm not here today to discuss the merits of that application. I'm not here to discuss the council's decision-making that application. That's outside the scope of the examination. I'm here only to discuss the allocation and the associated policy. The other side of that is if you have concerns that the council hasn't applied its own policy in regard to the application, well, that again is not really for me to determine. I'm not involved in that application in any way, shape or form, and that's obviously something between others and the council. The only, I think, area where the application might be relevant is insofar as understanding what the council was what the actual policy and plan is proposing, and understanding it, I guess as part of the concept. I don't want to get into a discussion about the nature of the application. Just want to make that clear, because I think in the stage one we did get a little bit of that and I allowed it, but I'm sort of want to be quite strict about that. As I'm going to start off by talking about some matters around the Greenbelt, some of which are quite generic and some of which are quite specific. So, with no further ado, in terms of RUR 07 Whitewebbs, what? Sorry, not without further ado. Clearly, we did talk about this at stage one. I had some concerns, which I set out in my letter, where I wasn't quite satisfied with some of the answers I got and some of the approach. I have to say, I'm probably some of these things I might be revisiting because I'm still not entirely satisfied with the answers I got and the modifications that were suggested. So I don't think we're there yet to where I was coming from. So there may be slightly going over some of the old ground, just in order for me to get where I need to be on these. So one of the first things on this site is, it says that it's allocated for nature recovery uses and provide professional sport, recreation and community sports leisure uses, including ancillary related facilities. That's what's in the table. Now, originally, you made it clear to me that there's no scale in the policy. It doesn't say anything about scale, doesn't say anything about the nature of those uses, the amount of built form, effects on openness of the Greenbelt, so on and so forth. None of those things are referenced. So looking at it from just what those words are, you might think it could just be open space and recreation, which may well fit into the exceptions in the framework. But when you look at CL4, I think it is, and some of these, there's an allusion to world-class sports facilities and things like that, which, and you made it clear in your initial evidence that it could lead to significant built form. Now, if it leads to significant built form, the logical conclusion is that it might breach the relevant paragraphs about whether or not these types of uses are appropriate, or shall we say, not inappropriate uses in the Greenbelt. Your answers to me before were, well, it's all right, because we'll deal with that when an application. We can't possibly know until an application comes in. Well, I doubt that, because A, you've already told me it could deliver significant built form. CL4 says that it's going to be world-class sports facilities and so on and so forth. There's an implication there that you do know what's likely to be coming forward. It's probably fair to say you could have a fair idea that it could be inappropriate development in the Greenbelt as a result of that. And therefore, first point, is it appropriate for a plan to allocate land without wishing to remove the land from the Greenbelt for development which it knows to be, or has a very good chance that it could be an appropriate development in the Greenbelt? That's the first point. And if it was going down that route and you knew that to be the case and that's what you were actually preparing, if the council points, we want this facility and we want it to be this world-class thing and it's going to have significant built form, yes, it might be deemed inappropriate, then would it not be appropriate to be removing that land from the green belt in order to facilitate it? Sorry, that was a long question.
No, the question's understood, sir. I accept that there is the potential for an allocation to come forward with built form that may be significant, depending on the particular circumstances. As to the degree of effect of that development, that will come down very much to the application in question. And it may well be that there is on the site itself only part of the site that would be regarded as delivering inappropriate development, whereas other parts of the site would be regarded as not inappropriate. So firstly, it wouldn't be right to simply reach the conclusion that because there is some degree of development that may be more than that which is within the confines of the parameters of the PPG, that therefore it's of such a scale that it would be appropriate in the circumstances to remove the entire site from the green belt. And that tolerance or that flexibility and fluctuation that can be apparent in any application, I'm putting to one side the application itself at the moment, that fluctuation has the ability to be reasonably significant in one direction or another. So it could be that the scheme may not deliver very much development, albeit development that is inappropriate in the green belt, but not, as I say, such as to require the removal of the land from the green belt. So there is a logic, given the nature of this particular site, there is a logic behind the conclusion that it shouldn't be removed from the green belt, even on that basis. There is, of course, the in principle point as well, that what one has at the moment is simply the description that one has in the plan. It's the general point I made last time. A description in the plan which wouldn't necessitate, on the face of it, a requirement to release the land from the green belt. There is a positive reason as well, or a positive part of my answer, which is that what the allocation does is provide a framework that will ultimately lead to the conclusion as to whether or not the development that is proposed, that does come forward, is inappropriate or not inappropriate, and require the various parameters to be that are set out within the plan to be passed. And that may mean that either there's reliance on the development not being inappropriate because it is of such a limited scale, if that's what comes forward, or it is of a scale that means that it's inappropriate and then will be required to be justified under very special circumstances. So it's the combination, not simply of the potentiality for development to come forward in a form that is not inappropriate, but also that even if it were, in terms of the built development, inappropriate, it's of a scale that, in combination with the totality of the site, justifies the conclusion that the whole site shouldn't then be removed from the green belt, or that there's a necessity to do so. So it's, I hope that makes it clear that there's that twofold aspect, and it does come down in part to the scale of the remainder of the land being used for purposes that are not inappropriate.
Yeah, sorry for those who are not enshrined in the framework. There's going to be a lot of talk of inappropriate, appropriate, not inappropriate, and appropriate in different contexts. So I apologise for that straight away because it's going to get quite confused. I obviously understand it, but we're going to be yes, that's going to come up a lot. The one thing you've just said, it talks about the policy aims to create an appropriate framework to determine this, but does it? Because and I don't want to get too much into criteria, but looking at generalities, the policy, nowhere does the policy say our starting point, Enfield Council starting point is this is what we expect, and we are expecting development to be either something which falls into paragraphs 1, 5, 154, I think it's 154 and 155 of the framework, and therefore we expect development that is meets the exceptions, is therefore appropriate in the Greenbelt. And that is what we will consider to be acceptable in principle, because that's what an allocation normally does. It provides certainty to a developer that this is what you're expected to do in order to be compliant with the local plan. And then if something's not compliant with the local plan, then obviously you go through all your other tests. And that's what isn't clear to me is what is the council's position, putting aside what decision it may have just made. What, in terms of writing this plan, is the council seeking a development which is 154, 155 compliant, i.e. it doesn't have a greater effect on openness than what is currently there, starting point? Or is it saying, no, actually, we as a council are content with development which is, in effect, inappropriate in the Greenbelt, but in determining that, we'll obviously need to look at the detail and determine whether the very special circumstances, because it will be dependent on the things you've just said. That's what I'm not really clear about, and I don't think I've got a clear understanding of what it is, what the council considered, irrespective of the permission, what the council considers through plan making, what it is you're actually saying. This is what we want you to deliver, developer. If it's the former, which is, development which is compliant with the Greenbelt policy, that's one thing, that's quite straightforward, because these uses, there's a criteria for these uses. If it's the latter, then I think we get into that matter, well, if you're already, you're promoting, effectively, the council is promoting development which is inappropriate in the Greenbelt, and is that an appropriate, justified approach?
What it's not doing is, you're quite right, sir, it's not saying one way or the other whether it is encouraging inappropriate development to deliver these elements or not. What it is saying is that these elements it wants to see delivered, namely sporting excellence and the provision of nature recovery uses. That's what it's seeking to achieve, and does so by way of ancillary related facilities, as it says. But it doesn't indicate how that is to be achieved, namely by way of either inappropriate development or not inappropriate development. Because actually the critical question is, for the council's purpose, is are those aims, which are actually, frankly, accepted by everybody as being laudable aims, are those aims being delivered on this site? And it encourages that to be done. How it achieves that, how the developer achieves that, is for the developer, and the developer will then have to justify that on the basis of either the exemptions within the PPF or very special circumstances. And as I say, the framework which exists is a framework that recognises that need for flexibility and fluctuation. And the position that the authority takes is that, well, either way is sound, because what ultimately will happen is that there'll be a proper evaluation of the relative merits of the proposal at the time of the application. And what this does, that's to say the allocation, is make clear the encouragement that the council gives to nature recovery uses and sport facilities, and provides a framework for the delivery of those elements, but without placing hard boundaries about how that is to be delivered. That's the reason behind or rather that's the purpose behind the allocation. And the difficult, I was going to say, so the difficulty is, of course, it may be right that in certain circumstances an application comes forward that does have inappropriate development, in which case, and that the council knows, and it wants to encourage that particular form of development. Let's say in another context that it's housing development. You know it's going to be it's going to be inappropriate development, and then you start to lay down the parameters with regard to that. In circumstances where there isn't a necessary relationship between, or there isn't a necessary delivery of inappropriate development, it's right in those circumstances to allow the flexibility to come forward in one direction or another. That's the the justification for it. It's sound and it's justifiable because it provides for either eventuality under the MPPF.
I'm already thinking about time and how, because no, it's not your fault. I'm thinking about how we could get into a very, very detailed discussion about this, perhaps, thing. But you could say the same about any form of development, could you? You could say, in theory, you could say, well, say housing development. It's only, is it inappropriate or appropriate? I'm just for the sake of watch it, not inappropriate. It's only appropriate once, it's only, inappropriate once you've determined whether there are special circumstances or something to that effect. So you could say, well, actually, we'll just allocate these sites, and then we'll wait for the application to come in before we determine whether it's acceptable or not. It's a sort of similar approach here.
I agree, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt. Again, just so you know our position, I agree that in circumstances where you have something that is obviously going to be inappropriate that's delivered on a site, to a large degree, it's going to be the principal element of the site's development. In those circumstances, one can see why, of course, there has to be further detail and acknowledgement as to what the parameters of that development is. But in circumstances where that isn't a necessary relationship, because there is the potential for delivery of development which is not inappropriate, and that's to say as small-scale ancillary structures that support sport and recreation that doesn't have an impact on openness, if that is capable of being delivered on a site, then in those circumstances it's right to recognise it. And it'd be wrong, conversely, to eliminate that option within the allocation. That's the approach that we take.
I suppose you would never eliminate the option, because planning doesn't work like that, does it? But I suppose taking it back to very first principles, what does the framework say about a policy? It should serve a purpose, and it should be clear and unambiguous to a decision maker how they should respond to an application. So we look at that. If I'm looking at it from the applicant's point of view, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know, if I'm an applicant, what the council is expecting of me. It seems to be saying, if particularly put the mods in, well, actually, it seems to be saying, well, if it's inappropriate development, you've got to demonstrate very special circumstances, which, of course, you have anyway. But you have anyway. So the allocation makes no odds, does it? Because the allocation serves no purpose in that respect, because it's not actually establishing a principle of development. This application could, and indeed has, but that's beside the point, come in without the allocation. The allocation doesn't really serve so what purpose does the allocation serve if it's not actually establishing the principle of development?
So what it serves is to establish the necessary relationship between the delivery of the sporting facilities and the nature recovery uses on the rest of the site. And a lot of the elements that go to the design principles recognise that interrelationship. So actually it's a framework that is careful to seek to provide for the wholesale delivery of the various principles that are identified. And it helps to provide then a framework within, as I say, a framework within which a judgment can be reached as to whether very special circumstances are established.
So, sorry, same with all three of these sites, really. You can only determine whether or not it's acceptable in principle once an application comes in. To some extent, that's the same with anything. But here, you are literally saying we don't know whether or not this is acceptable until an application comes in, and then we will decide whether very special circumstances apply or not. So, and I think I did pick up this, I did ask this question last time, is that have very special circumstances been predetermined?
That's exactly why. So, I mean, our response to that, but our point is that no, there isn't an establishment of very special circumstances, particularly given the clarity within the modifications that are proposed, which make plain that that isn't the position. But it does identify those as relevant factors that go to the question of the judgment being reached. Of course, the degree to which you're in accordance both with what is aimed for with regard to RUR 07 in its totality and its compliance with the design principles will then help to indicate whether very special circumstances have been established. So, for example, if all you do is deliver the sport facilities but you don't deliver any of the nature recovery aspects, then that will be a proposal that doesn't, in overall terms, describe or follow the approaches adopted within the allocation.
But again, the policy makes no, not fair, I suppose, but the decision maker, I mean, the other thing is, sorry, where the decision maker who's not been part of this exercise, not been sat here listening, will infer from what is written in the plan that matter of principle has been established. Because it's only when you look at, if you like, your modified version, the references are quite not necessarily smacking in the face that this is what we're, the decision, any decision on this site is based on this set of parameters and this set of understanding. We understand, and so it's not a given that any form of development which meets these uses is automatically acceptable in the Greenbelt. The policy doesn't really tell me, it doesn't tell me what the council thinks about openness. What extent of openness can be harmed and still have a chance of being VSC. What the nature of the nature recovery is and still have an opportunity. What it doesn't tell me, unless you infer it, that these are the factors that we will take into account and we will have regard to in determining whether very special circumstances exist, if that test is necessary.
Yeah, I agree. So, and I think the comment that you make at the end of that, if they're necessary, is the important point, because you need to be careful to provide enough breadth within the allocation itself. And what this isn't doing, nor seeking to do, is set down any of those specific parameters. What it is doing is providing a broad support for those elements, for the reasons that are set out in other parts of the plan. And sporting excellence is something that's significant. But for a policy to be sound, it doesn't need to have those sorts of those parameters in place in order to meet the relevant parts of the MPPF. What it has to do is meet the tests of soundness. In this case, sorry to interrupt, it'll be effective. Is it effective? And as I say, part of the test of effectiveness is whether or not it's clear and unambiguous as to whether or not it is, if it's usable and it's clear and unambiguous. That's the point I'm getting at. I'm not currently convinced. I don't keep my powder dry on most things, but I'll be honest about it. I'm not currently convinced. I'm not saying that the allocation, whether the allocation itself is unsound or not, that's not for now. Whether the policy is effective is a different, perhaps, question. I'm not currently convinced that the policies are effective in setting out how a decision maker will go about, and it might all be moot. By the time we get to it, it might be built, who knows, but that's why I'm concentrating on this very much point. I'm not convinced by that point. Yeah. Yes. What I would say, just note my powers of advocacy in that case. Despite all I've said, you still remain unconvinced. But what in terms of looking at effectiveness, it's effectiveness in respect of the policy that is being proposed. There may be another better way of setting out a policy in respect of any particular parcel of land. But the question is whether it's effective for the purpose that it is seeking to achieve. And what it's seeking to achieve is encouragement of development that is either appropriate or inappropriate on the site.
Yeah, so we're in danger.
So in short, it doesn't need to do...
We're going to go around in circles a bit, but I still maintain if an application came in for 10 square metres of sport and recreation facilities, or 10,000 square metres of sport and recreation facilities, I don't know what is acceptable and what isn't on the basis of this policy. And I think I would suggest that to be an effective policy, an effective allocation, that's one of the things, understanding the scale of development which the council considers to be acceptable is one of the tests that I might consider to be important.
The position is noted, sir, and we'll take that away.
Okay. Well, I'll obviously have to give that some thought.
Yes.
Thank you. There's a couple of references in, and I just want to be again clear we're all on the same page. There's a couple of references in the statements and evidence base to it being acceptable for plans to allocate sites which are acceptable, or uses rather, which are acceptable in the green belt in principle, sort of as they are here. And I just want to be clear, that's actually not what the framework, they're not acceptable in principle. There's a test for both buildings and the change of use of land. So it's not like, for example, agricultural uses where they are exempt. They're an exception. There's an automatic exception. Yeah. So there's an inbuilt test. So it's not quite the same allocating land, allocating these. It's not a, where the use is very clear. That is exempt, and you wouldn't allocate a site for agricultural use. You wouldn't need to. But, so it is a slight difference, isn't it? That there's the potential here, as we've already established, for development which is in effect harmful to the green. We know inappropriate development is by definition harmful to the green belt. So the plan is promoting uses which are potentially harmful to the green belt without taking them out of the green belt.
Yes, it is. But as I say, sir, there's a particularly with regard to Whitewebbs, there's a clear context, which is the extent of the site that is being proposed and the amount of land that will remain in open use.
Okay. So there is a potential outcome, isn't there, that an application come in for these uses, which would be refused because it would not meet. So the way you're telling me, that it's not a given, an application that you could fail the test. So
The test for inappropriate development.
Yeah, and sorry, no test. It would be inappropriate development, but then test would fail VSC.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and indeed, there's a recognition of that within the modifications themselves, because it says that you need to establish VSC if it is not inappropriate, if it is inappropriate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a potential, say, circular logic thing. It's in the local plan. I assume it's okay. I've covered this point. I say some of this is for me to go away and think about, having heard your response about how we're getting, what is the starting point for the council and what is acceptable. But I've taken your points on that. You've told me it won't be. We'll come on to the modifications shortly. Right, okay. I was going to move on to I've sort of covered most of the things on 4.71 and 2. My question 4.73 was about the council acknowledging that it's not carried out any assessment of compliance with national green belt policy. You've indicated it's justified to assess compliance with national policy when an application is submitted. Well, I suppose that's true of many things. But that's often when it's a matter of detail, isn't it? So, as I say, it is a little bit hopping on the same point. You allocate a site for housing, it comes in, you go, well, actually, here's a list of what we want. You've not met that, therefore it's not acceptable. But you've established the principle. And I think I see coming back to this, well, is it okay to allow the assessment of compliance with national policy in a situation where the principle is at stake?
Yes, so it comes back to the original question, I think, which is what is the significance, or is it appropriate in the circumstances to allow this proposal to remain in the plan, but for it still to remain as greenbelt land? And there's no particular test that would lead one to the conclusion that land must be removed from the greenbelt if anything is proposed on it. That comes down to an assessment as to whether or not it's appropriate in the circumstances to take that step. Now, and again, I don't want to go back over it. You know my point, which is that, look, if it is delivering something which in the main is going to be an open use, then there would be no purpose or it wouldn't be appropriate, indeed, for it to be removed from the greenbelt. And in this case, given that it may be on a relative scale, that's to say looking at the building in question, that it's regarded as inappropriate, it is a small part of a very large site that still should remain within the greenbelt. And if it does have to stay in the greenbelt, well then in those circumstances it would be quite wrong for the plan to identify a specific form of development that must come forward. That should be left for the promotion of the site itself. So once you reach the conclusion that it is appropriate for it to stay in the greenbelt, and indeed everybody around the table would suggest that it should remain in the greenbelt. The question is, how do you best control development? And what you shouldn't be doing is seeking to, as I say, tramline that into a particular route.
I mean, I'm not necessarily arguing, well, I'm not coming to a view on it should be removed from the greenbelt. I suppose what I'm trying to understand is whether the plan is taking me through those arguments you've made. Does the plan set out clearly and effectively how a decision is going to be made, what's going to be taken into account, and how national greenbelt policy is influencing the decision making, and whether or not it's already been determined that it's suitable, all these things, and come together without necessarily saying you must take development, because as I say, in theory somebody could say, well, allocate land for any use in the greenbelt, and say, well, we don't think we need to take out the greenbelt because for the reasons you've given. But there's a logic mostly when it's housing or employment that comes out because it wouldn't be justified. So there might well be, I'm not necessarily arguing the only alternative is that land must come out of the greenbelt. Yes. I'm trying to understand what the council, I suppose effectively, what are you promoting? Is it clear what you're promoting? Is the policy reflecting what you're promoting? And is that justified? And is it effective decision making? Those are all the questions that are going through my head.
Yes. I've
highlighted some concerns I've got your answer to that. I'll have to take those away with me.
Yes.
One thing I will just say, look about the very special circumstances been predetermined or not. Your Regulation 22 statement, and I was looking at the comments in relation to representations made, and the response to comments by CPRE London, the final part of the response of the Reg 22 statement states that the comprehensive planning approach ensures that the benefits of the development outweigh the potential negative impacts, aligning with broader regional and national policies. So just going back into, we haven't done that assessment, well, that reads to me like an element, you have done that assessment because you've determined that the benefits of that outweigh the harm. We don't know. We don't know what the harm is because we don't know what the harm's going to be until the application's been. So some assumption's been made there, hasn't it, about the form?
Certainly, perhaps ask Dr. Jones just to comment on that. And what I would say is that certainly in the light of the way that the policy has been drafted, that really, I suspect, needs to be read as being an in-principle statement as to the ability of those various aspects to overcome any policy objections, whether it be in part because there's some inappropriate development or because it's not inappropriate. But I'll leave that for Dr. Jones to perhaps indicate whether or not there has been any determined assessment of the benefits outweighing the harm.
No, I confirm that assessment hasn't been carried out. And I apologise if the wording in the Reg 22 statement implies that, but I don't think that was the intention.
Okay. So I'm just going to move on to the before I open it up for issues around greenbelt issues. 4.74 was about the modifications. I asked in document 97, I raised some concerns and actions, to which you've responded with some changes to CL4, I think, and PL9. As far as I can tell, they restate national policy. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the point I was making. In fact, the point I was making is the point I've been making now, which is it clear what it is the council considers to be acceptable, and at what point? I guess it's what point do you get concerned, and where, if you're, say, an applicant, you understand at what point what you're proposing isn't likely to be acceptable, even if it's. Some policies aren't that. So maybe go around the country. Some policies, in determining this application, we will have regard to the following issues. And it doesn't have to say categorically this is a threshold, but it's that kind of thing. Where does my concern, I think, was where the bar is in this. And I think just restating national policy doesn't necessarily get you anywhere, because it only takes me back to my earlier point, which was, well, why, if you're just applying national policy on these sites, why are they allocated anyway? What are you trying to achieve? You may say you already answered that. I don't know.
Well, only so that what it's seeking to achieve is the delivery of something more than just one aspect. It says very clearly that it's trying to deliver not just the sporting facilities, but nature recovery. And so it does provide, as I say, a framework within which the various issues need to be, or the various matters need to be, the various aims need to be delivered.
Okay, thank you. Right. So, anyone, anything to say about matters that I've not raised, or is it about matters relating to Greenbelt? Quod?
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to pick up on just a couple of points to expand on following your discussions with Mr. Reid. I think the obvious question coming out of those was, to me anyway, what's the merit in allocating the site, given we're not seeking Greenbelt removal, and Greenbelt policy in the MPPF covers inappropriate and appropriate development. And for me, I think the answer is threefold. I think the Council's policy firstly recognises a need to promote world-class sporting facilities. I think secondly, the site is uniquely positioned in this respect. It currently provides a world-class sporting facility at the Tottenham Hotspur training ground. There are extant consents to deliver additional development of a similar ilk, and there are proposals with resolution to grant which would do the same. The club has a unique and significant social and economic position in the borough. And thirdly, I think the MPPF does require local plans to plan positively to enhance the beneficial use of the Greenbelt, alongside planning for healthy and inclusive places, social and recreational facilities for communities, etc. So, to my mind, there's a very clear purpose to the allocation. Linked to that, then, the second point is, how does that allocation deliver on it, linking back to your questions around what is expected of a developer. I think at the moment there's already a mix of appropriate and inappropriate development across the sites. Similarly, the sites that have planning permission and the sites that are proposed for development with a resolution to grant also have a mix of inappropriate and appropriate development. And as you picked up on, sir, I think it's important to remember that different scales of development will come forward across this site. The obvious one is significant regeneration of Whitewebbs. But to contrast that, the club have applications in at the moment for small-scale extensions to their existing training centre. So there will be different scales that come forward. And even appropriate Greenbelt development is subject to other tests of openness and Greenbelt purposes, etc. I think we've proposed and agreed a statement of common ground with the council, which proposes some modifications to the policy to make it explicit that the MBPPF Greenbelt tests and policies still apply. I think at the moment, in its draft form, the plan would be read alongside the MPPF and would make sense together. I think what those modifications do is make it clear and explicit, if you were to read the policy in isolation, that it is still subject to Greenbelt tests. And it's clear that schemes need to be assessed on their own merits, and Greenbelt policy still applies. And then just to conclude on your point around what is the bar for developers, from our side, I think the bar is very clearly established by the NPPF. It doesn't need to be set by the local plan in our view. And if the local plan was to try and do something different to the NPPF, it would almost certainly be found unsound. So I think that to go back to the start, the bar is what the NPPF says. Policy is clear, that's the NPPF applies, but there is a very clear purpose to this allocation, in our view, around the position of the site as a world-class sporting facility, and how it can deliver significant social and economic benefits in that context.
Thank you very much. Before I move on to more general matters of what's in the, is it a suitable location for this form of development, irrespective of Greenbelt, and then the development requirements, anything? No, I'll say no. Okay, thank you.
So can I just raise one point?
Yeah.
Something I should have said earlier on, but I missed it. And it's CL4 that you've probably seen anyway, as well as the allocation itself. But it does set out a number of aspects that are to be regarded as development management issues that will provide a further level of framework within which to consider the proposal. There's about 7 or 8 different aspects.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, I'm concentrating today on 07 because obviously we'll have a session at CL4. Perhaps I didn't ask my question about CL4, so I don't want to muddy the waters by too much, but we'll inevitably get there.
We will come on to that.
And today's discussion anyway will help with that. I mean, if anybody raises something about CL4, then at least I can put a pin in it and remind myself to deal with it. 'Tis the nature of this plan, and many plans to have. We've got things in different parts of the plan, dealing with different things. It can be a bit
Quite so. The only reason I also raise it is because Mr. Byland referred to it and referred to the modifications in the Statement of Common Ground. They now refer directly to CL4.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm just going to open, the modification schedule while I'm at it.
I was going to say, so this particular modification isn't in 6.1. It's in.
Yes, I noticed it was. Yeah, sorry. I'm just more for the next step. Yes, I did note that at the time I noted that the modification schedule didn't address IN7. I kept my own counsel on that until given the opportunity to address that, which you did. So, okay, right. Let me just get to suggested modifications for this policy. Fine. Right, so I've got some. So we'll move on to my questions, which were sort of taking everything else, which was 4.75. If you're following through the MIQs, 4.75 to 4.77. I'll try and 4.79 actually, but I'll try and pick up the mods as we go through the requirements, if there's a relevant mod, but if I miss any, we'll wash up at the end. But in terms of strategy, so my question 4.75 is about, it's a question I've asked on every site, is there anything, if you like, fundamental about the allocation that suggests it shouldn't be allocated for any particular constraint or consistent with your spatial strategy, and any particular constraints which render the site problematic or unacceptable. In terms of landscape, no, I've got another point. This is the first time we've looked at Appendix C. So just in detail, there is a question, so we've now got to Appendix C. There's one, again, some general point I just want to cover about the tables and things and how it's laid out. I asked some preliminary questions about this, just for clarity, about what is and what isn't policy. And I think I was told that in the tables, policy is the proposal, row, the infrastructure requirements and the design principles, and everything else is, I suppose, effectively then supporting text. And I think there were some modifications perhaps proposed to make that clear. I think I'll once we've been through all 100 allocations, it will become clear whether that approach is helpful or not, and whether or not any changes, but we won't worry too much about that now. I think I talked about this at stage 1, just to get some clarification, or certainly again preliminary questions. You've got the site considerations, where you've got flood zones, PTAL rating, heritage considerations, and archaeological priority areas. I guess we're treating that as supporting text or reason justification. I guess you might get allocations which point these things out, so it might be helpful. I just wondered the extent to which, why is it only that, of all the constraints a site might include, why are those there, and are they particularly helpful, or do they become a hindrance, particularly if you're looking at a site like this one, for example, which I know you've suggested that the red should be amber, but putting that to one side, a red mark against the plan on heritage grounds, is that not something we should be worried about? So is it sending an odd mix? And I'm thinking about general effectiveness and justification. It's sending a bit of a mixed message. I'm sure it's trying to be helpful and saying, when you're delivering this site, you should have a mind to the fact that these are these, but equally, a RAG rating, is that helpful?
Yes, I know that Dr. Jones will have something to say about it. There was a proposal, it's under modification 361. There was no magic really in that statement other than that I'm supposed to move my microphone further, so closer to me, so I'll just do that. I don't know whether that's any better.
I can hear you anyway, sorry.
Yes, there is proposed to be a key dealing with the heritage RAG rating that identifies the issues to be considered under each one of the RAG definitions. But as to the more general question as to whether that's helpful, Dr. Jones, I don't know whether you have something to add to that.
Yeah, just on this. So the site considerations there are a number of considerations that we could have chosen to include as part of the site allocations, and we chose to focus on 4 particularly pertinent ones to development coming forward, so flood zone status, PTAL rating, heritage considerations and impacts on archaeology. So we thought those were, I guess, the most pertinent, so we've got around 100 site allocations, so of course not all of them will be as relevant to all sites as to others, but we thought as a kind of general approach just to guide development coming forward, this would be the kind of key considerations for people conceiving development proposals.
And again, sorry for those who are talking specifics, I want to get these, because it's the first time we've come to these, so I just want to get it out of the way, and we won't need to come together unless somebody else raises it. Because I can understand why heritage, where heritage is highlighted as amber, or I'm assuming, I would hope, to see something in the design principles which would reflect that and say, development should. And I'll be honest, there are occasions I think I've been going through and not found that relationship, which I will be asking about. But you would expect that, so that's understandable. Flood zones, obviously, again, if it's identified as being a flood zone, I would expect, if it's gone through the sequential approach and exception test properly, it's still probably not unreasonable for a policy to say, if it's possible, development should avoid the areas of flood zone 3 or flood zone 2. That can happen. Or if it can't, then it must be, deliver safety and so on and so forth. So those are understandable sort of relationships. PTAL zone is a bit an odd one because obviously it's been allocated. I don't really know where the PTAL zone gets you. You've allocated it presumably because you would consider it to be a sustainable location, unless you've got a policy which I don't know what that's really telling me, but okay, I suppose it's information. But I suppose if there are other, because of the nature, because of the way this is set out, you've got this tabular approach, there's no scope for any other helpful supporting information that you would often find in an allocation by the reason justification, as I insist on calling it, would tell you all of the, would go through all of the things which are relevant to that site and explain the constraints. So you've hindered yourself a little bit in format. I don't know where that takes us, but I just think it's something I'll probably have to give some thought to in terms of, is it a soundness issue or not, but is it affecting effectiveness, as I was saying, is it actually causing more problems than it's helping in terms of effectiveness? Because the other side to effectiveness for me is, it comes back to clear and unambiguous. Is this muddying waters unnecessarily and going to cause issues for decision makers, or unintended consequences, I imagine.
That's understood, sir. And I think it's certainly something that, if it does need to be redacted in order to achieve effectiveness, we can do that, because there's still, for example, in respect of Whitewebbs, it does deal with the issues in heritage terms that is of significance. See, for example, criterion E under the design principles.
Quite, yeah. So it's picking up on it. And as I say, all the plans take, every plan deals with it differently, but
yes,
there'd be text that shows.
Yeah.
So it's a formatting issue. Okay, sorry about that. That was a slight digression. So in terms of this site, then, landscape. The site is in a locally listed landscape and could affect local views, and that's sort of set out in the evidence. Correct me if I'm wrong. I note from your statement that the Greenbelt assessment concludes built development, if confined to existing building clusters and footprints, can minimise harm. Is that what the policy expects? Or is that what you expect as a council, for it to be on existing clusters and footprints?
Well, the policy doesn't require it. I mean, I'm aware of the existing planning application where that form of development has been proposed and has been found acceptable by the council. But yeah, it doesn't. The policy doesn't intend to kind of prejudge that or be specific about where on the site built form needs to be accommodated. But instead sets out a framework for managing any additional built form in a sensitive way. So, for example, landscape character and kind of qualities alluded to in criterion E, as is the kind of heritage assets and other qualities of the site in other parts of the design principles.
Okay, thank you. Presumably, again, because of the things we've talked about already, is that in terms of the policy, unlike, say, housing, you have a clear idea of what you're going to be accepting because you have a more flexible, open view. You've not presumably done any detailed assessment of impact on local landscape because that would be something that comes through. So, yeah, okay. Fine. Are there any forms of development that might be associated with proposed uses, and not the proposed uses in the application, but proposed uses in the list, which also refers to ancillary relating to facilities, for example, which would give rise to particular concerns about the local landscape? And in this respect, I suppose I'm thinking of things like floodlights or fencing or things like that, which are obviously often associated with this type of facility. Are they things which might give rise, and anything which the policy could or should have had an eye on?
Yeah, absolutely. So those are the two important considerations. So floodlighting, the impact of floodlighting, especially on kind of wider landscapes, and impacts on biodiversity, and the impact of fencing on the sense of openness. So that's been controlled through, well, as we discussed, allusions to the MPPF. But then we've also got, I think it was policy CL5, which does particularly seek to control the impact of floodlighting on the surrounding environment. And then also in terms of fencing and the sense of openness, I think it's policy PL11, which kind of highlights...
It's definitely not, because that's Cruise Hill.
Oh, sorry.
PL9?
DE11.
Oh, DE11.
Sorry, apologies.
But you've got to be impressed. I mean, a little bit.
So yeah, there are important considerations which are controlled both within the design principles and other policies in the plan.
Okay, and this actually speaks to one of the perennial issues when examining a plan, when you've got allocations which list certain lists of issues, but they're obviously reading the plan as a whole. You've got other policies which pick out these things, and these policies, and there's always that perennial argument about should the site-specific policy say something specific? Well, argument no, because the plan is read as a whole, but by the same token, there are probably criteria in A to M which actually also are covered by generic policies, and you might not need it. And what it always leads to is that kind of consistency approach. So somebody might say, well, if you've mentioned flood risk in a site-specific policy, it's obviously important to that site. But you've not mentioned floodlights, so it's not. And it's, again, that's probably for me to think about and you to think about. I often, it's hard to know where the issue, because technically speaking, the plan is read as a whole. So what you said is actually right. But then people reading the policy, it does mention that. So is it? But you have mentioned other things, and it becomes where people say, well, it's not important there, it is important there. So that's internal consistency, quite important. But again, it's probably for me to think about, well, is this effective without mentioning or cross-referring to these other policies?
That's something that can be done, because it's more appropriate to cross-reference those that do refer to floodlighting, for example, within the design principles themselves and Appendix C. So at least then it's directly related.
Yeah. Thank you. And I say, it's a constant. It's not. It comes up in every examination. That does. In terms of heritage, you've said, I think, that in your statement that the no designated heritage assets within the footprint of, and I'm quoting here, but I didn't write the paragraph down, in the footprint of proposed development zones. But the question obviously is, where are the proposed development zones? Because the inset map doesn't have any, and I don't think the policies map has any. So where are those? Do you know where the defined development zones are?
In answer to your question, sir, no, we don't know where the defined development zone are. That was, regrettable wording, I'd say, in that particular sentence. There are a number of heritage assets on site, both designated and undesignated. Most notably, several listed buildings.
Okay, thank you. We've already talked about this. Has got a red designation on heritage. I know that you've suggested a modification to make it amber, but on the basis of what is there, and you've just said there's quite a few heritage assets designated on. Does that give any rise to significant risk of harm to heritage assets, and/or is the policy sufficiently robust to protect them?
So the design principles have sought to address the issue of heritage, most notably at points E and F. And I know we're not talking about the extant planning application, but that's an example of how heritage assets have been weighed against kind of harms and benefits and conclusions drawn.
Is the point that, as far as council is concerned, again, agnostic about the planning application, but the in principle, a satisfactory. There's a reasonable likelihood that a satisfactory. It seems a bit of a silly thing to say when I know you've granted permission, but there's a reasonable likelihood that a suitable form of development can be achieved, which doesn't result in unacceptable harm, basically. So
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, suitable form of development in terms of kind of nature recovery or sporting uses could be achieved without having an acceptable impact on heritage assets.
Okay, thank you. And criterion F, I'm jumping into a little bit of all this. Criterion F does talk about enhancing heritage assets. Is that... the number of times I read in local plan that development should preserve or enhance, and I say, well, sorry, preserve and enhance. And I say, well, is it about... definitely enhancing, or is it, yes, if it enhances, brilliant, but is that actually the test? Are you actually requiring development to enhance heritage assets? And have you identified which heritage assets you're expecting to be enhanced and how?
I think the enhancement of heritage assets is definitely certainly an aspiration that we'd like to see development coming forward and achieving on this site. So it's something we'd like to set a framework for colleagues assessing applications to be able to kind of push for that, and also for applicants to be in no doubt that we'd expect them to take the issue of heritage seriously and look to enhance assets on site.
This is a good example, actually, I think, of the what I've noticed, again, absolutely every local plan I've ever examined and written, must and should, and the debate between must and should. And I've had this debate many times, and some councils will say those two meanings, they're synonymous, and they don't actually mean anything different, and I will question that. And the fact that here, I think you've got must and should quite a lot, actually. There's a lot of musts and shoulds, and I think it's interesting to know what is the council's position on must versus should. Am I to take it that they're not meant as synonymous? They are. There is a difference in how application will be interpreted in that respect.
So I think should is an obligation, but must is an instruction, is the way that I interpret this. So yeah, must is it's a kind of stronger imperative than should.
Yeah. I mean, must is absolutely clear and unambiguous. I think there's no doubt about that. You must do that. You should do that. So, for example, because this is the first should actually in the policy, should restore and enhance heritage assets on site. If an application came in which didn't do that, for whatever reason, you might well no doubt question that, you challenge that. But if it didn't do that, would you be then saying it's contrary to policy because it's only a should and not a must?
I think if it didn't do that, it wouldn't meet one of the detailed policy requirements. So it would be up to the decision maker to kind of judge the planning balance as to whether the proposals as a whole.
Would you give, shall we say, less weight? Do you think as a should? And I ask this for several reasons, because this will come up a lot, because a lot of the main mods you've suggested change shoulds to musts. So presumably that's another reason why I assume there's an actual meaning to it. And so I think I need to look closely at the shoulds versus the musts. I think particularly when it comes to things like impact on heritage, impact on biodiversity, if it says things like should mitigate harm, it's not a should, is it? It's a must. Here, should restore and enhance. So there's no national policy requirement to restore and enhance. The national policy requirement is to preserve. So that's a different thing. So this is an aspiration then, presumably not a requirement.
I think it's a little stronger than aspiration, but yeah, it stops short of being a kind of hard and fast requirement.
Thank you. The statement again, sorry to repeat, it said the site is not subject to high flood risk, but the flooding topic paper places the site in flood zones 2 and 3. So can I just have some clarity?
Can we come back to you on that point? I think it will take a little time for us to track that down.
Fine.
Unless Dr. Jones can get to it straight away.
I mean, fine. Obviously, we're not talking about more vulnerable users necessarily in this context. I like to make sure I understand, because
yes,
where I get divergence of information, it's just useful to know.
Absolutely.
Because obviously, one question is whether the sequential approach has been adhered to correctly. I will just say this, and you perhaps again look at this if in the round. In terms of the sequential approach, the table in the topic paper states that this site, as with all the others actually, has passed the sequential approach because all other alternatives have been discounted from further consideration through the HELA. But the HELA wouldn't have taken into account this site, would it? Because it's not a housing or employment site.
Again, sir, I'd need to.
Yeah. If I pick these questions up and then you can give me an answer. One might assume, though, that if you're talking about, shall we, in inverted commas, world-class sporting facilities, the sequential approach probably limits the opportunities you've got. So I mind that, but I want to make, if you've said it in the topic paper, I want to make clear what you said. So fine, if you could come back on that then.
Certainly, sir, yes. We will.
Will this allocation, without bearing in mind what the again, not what the application does, but will the allocation does the principle of the allocation result in the loss of publicly accessible open space? And if it does the has that carried out any assessment of that in line with national policy about in what circumstances public open space or open space should be lost?
So the previous use of the site was as a golf course that had limited public access. We understand that the public were allowed access to this site so long as they didn't affect play. So what the allocation intends to do is to maximise publicly accessible open space, aside from the part of the site that's devoted to elite sporting activity.
Thanks. Okay. Just looking at the criteria, I'm not sure it says anything about maximising public open space, but maybe something I've got to, you could take. But anyway, I will come on to those later. And obviously, given the existing uses of the site, is it likely to be subject to any biodiversity constraints? I mean, obviously, again, the allocation talk about nature recovery uses, so presumably within that, it's actually seen as an opportunity rather than a constraint. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's intended to be an opportunity. So the site is next to two sinks, and there's lots of kind of other wider assets in the much broader area. So the intention is to improve biodiversity as a result of this allocation.
And is that set out in the development design principles, I should say, or infrastructure requirements? Possibly. I mean, the question there would be if that's over and above what your BNG requirements would be. Is it something different to that, I suppose, would be the question. Because if it's BNG, you've got a policy on that, which we'll be coming on to. Is it something in excess of that?
That's it, yeah. So I'll draw your attention to criterion D of the design principles.
Yes, fine. Yes,
yeah.
criterion.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry to just take one back shortly, take one back slightly. In terms of where the statement was made that the site is within flood zones 2 and 3, I think you said. Did you have the reference again for that?
So I think it's in the topic. It's in the flooding topic paper.
It's in that. Thank you.
If I've made a mistake,
No,
yeah, but it's in the flooding topic paper, or the flood risk topic paper has a table with every allocation, I think.
Yes. Thank you. In that case, I'll check through that. Thank you very much.
That table doesn't actually always tell me how much of the site is. It might be very small levels.
We had that debate in stage 1, so
yeah, quite right. In terms of, sticking with biodiversity for a second, I've had references in representations to there being areas of ancient woodland within the site. Is that the case?
A very small portion of the, I believe, western extent of the site is occupied by Whitewebbs wood, which is a sink. And Whitewebbs wood is described in our sink review as a area of ancient and semi-natural woodland with small pockets of ancient replanted woodlands on site.
So is there just thinking about the allocation, why is that part of the site allocated then if it's ancient woodland? Is that presumably not seeking to have any development in there?
This is something we could look into in greater detail, sir, because I'm unclear as to whether the part of Whitewebbs wood which extends into the site allocation boundary is occupied by ancient woodland. That's something I'll have to check.
Okay. If it is, I mean, obviously the question would be whether, I mean, again, there are obviously general policies relating to ancient woodland, both national and local. Again, there'd be a debate there as to whether the specific site allocation policy would need to refer to that, because obviously you'd always defer to that, but it's always that question. I say it's a perennial question, bound to come up. Particularly when we get into site housing allocations, I expect people, well, why doesn't it say that? But I think if it's a sink and ancient woodland, I suppose one question would be is why is it in the allocation, and does it need to be in the allocation? Again, maybe you can come back on that.
Yeah, I'll come back on that on the kind of point of factual clarity, but just to say on that broader point that criterion D of the design principles does promote nature recovery, including tree planting and biodiversity enhancements, and that would kind of enhance the biodiversity value of the site and kind of use the existing kind of sink context as a kind of basis to improve biodiversity in the site overall.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be in the allocation together, does it? Because you can have off-site improvements. You can, I suppose, does it matter either way? But a big question. That might be a question for me to consider. If it's in the allocation, does it? Is there some inference that more amenable to development within that area than you would in the rest of the area? That kind of thing would be going through my mind. But I think it's for if you could get me some just a note to say or an answer, is it ancient woodland or not? That'd be. But it's a sink anyway, so it doesn't alter. But ancient woodland's obviously a level above. And in terms of, I'm still looking at the overall sort of strategy and constraints, the transport terms, I don't think TfL have referred to the site's relatively poor accessibility, and that it should exclude major trip generating uses unless there is substantial investment in public transport. So just again, generally speaking, how does is the site expected to deliver major trip generating uses? That's the first question. Is that actually part? Because again, going back to what the actual land use requirements are, you wouldn't necessarily draw that conclusion. It's open space and it's professional sport and recreation. There's no sense of scale, so I don't know if it's 5 people turn up or 5,000 people turn up. So, but where does it sit in sort of your spatial strategy from a transport perspective?
So in addressing that point, we've agreed some proposed modifications to the requirements of RUR 07 with TfL, and that does talk about limiting major trip generating uses only to those related to the site's primary uses, which are nature recovery, professional sport, recreation, and some community sports and leisure uses as well.
Okay, we'll have a look at those. Right, so I'm going to now, where I haven't already picked up, I'm going to move on to the actual policy itself quite quickly, and then we'll see if any points. We'll try and get this site done before we have a break, so slightly longer, and then might mean the next site, so quite a bit quicker. Talked about musts and shoulds. We'll no doubt come back to that at various times. I obviously asked a question about the scale and density, and you say in your statement the scale of development is appropriate to its greenbelt setting and supports sustainable development. But we've already debated this. How does anyone determine the scale of the development process? So how can you conclude that it is appropriate to its greenbelt setting when we don't know what it is? I mean, are you saying that development should be appropriate to its greenbelt setting? Is that a policy test you're seeking to impose? In terms of the scale of development, we're expecting development to be appropriate to its greenbelt setting. Is that your expectation?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know what that means in practice, because there is no such thing as a greenbelt setting. Is everything pretty much different?
And I think considering this, we kind of return again, as we did at the start, to national policy requirements, where outdoor sport and recreation uses are not inappropriate, necessarily subject to impact on openness, and I think that would be our starting point in considering what would be appropriate to a greenbelt setting.
Okay. Thanks. I've done that. The under land use requirements, this is about the first part of the question about scale and density and type of development. Is it clear? Under land use requirements, it refers to ancillary related uses. I've talked about those briefly. What might those be? and is it clear what those might be? And I'm again taking it back to what paragraph 154B says. So 154B, at least in terms of, gives you a scope to say some of these uses are potentially not inappropriate in the green belt. Because, but I don't know what the ancillary uses are. So would they actually fall into the category? I mean, are they all? You would only envisage things which actually fall into that category. So presumably things like food and drink or something like that. So what is an ancillary use?
So I guess it was the intention behind that wording was to capture certain kind of forms of development, things like things that might be needed in terms of to facilitate outdoor sports and recreation. So things like changing facilities, kind of maintenance huts, things like that would be relatively modest features in the landscape potentially, but would be required to facilitate the use of the site for outdoor sport and recreation.
Okay, thanks. It may be that might need to be set out. I suppose you could literally use those words and say, development would, ancillary uses will be expected to be those things which are needed to facilitate those uses.
Well, so it may be sensible to take that step. The Harrods Court of Appeal case dealt with what's meant by ancillary, and it looks at uses that are ancillary in the usual sense associated with the use in question. So to make it clearer, it would be perhaps sensible.
I mean, again, it's law. I don't know if we'll ever get into a debate in this one, but what is ancillary and what is complementary? I have lots of hours of fun deciding to determine that one. We've talked about whether or not the plan or the policy refer to openness. I'm going to take that away with me. I'll think more on the openness issue. Infrastructure requirements. Yeah, I suppose this is another thing which is coming to for the first time, so we may as well pick it up, is the practical difference. You've got two columns, two rows, infrastructure requirements and design principles. They're both classed as policy. But is there any practical difference between the two? Because I ask because quite often when reading them, not so much here because you've only got one, subject to modifications, but I read what's in the infrastructure requirements and I read what's in the design principles, and they're often pretty much the same thing. So is there a practical difference between them?
It's a fair observation. Mm-hmm. So it's a fair observation. I don't think there is necessarily a requirement to. I mean, it doesn't appear as though there's any particular magic behind them being described as infrastructure requirements rather than design principles. They both set the framework for the development. So if you thought it was appropriate, it would certainly be possible to combine those elements.
Okay. I'll think about that. I mean, like I said, it might be something and nothing. I think where it will apply is when we get into whether it's issues of unnecessary duplication. In terms of, and I ask this here because if you look at should contribute towards enhanced pedestrian and cycle connectivity, and then you look at criteria B, I, J, and K, they all refer to pedestrian improvements. So it's sort of redundant, isn't it, to a degree? But again, it's probably something, once we've been through all of these sites, all of this will come out in the wash. Just looking at the infrastructure there, you've got, I'll pick up the main modifications, suggested modifications while we are at them. So at the moment we have just criterion 1, should contribute towards enhanced pedestrian and cycle connectivity. You suggested some changes to that say must prioritise active travel infrastructure. This would probably be a good point again to get into matters of principle. I asked generally in every, are the changes proposed in E61 necessary to make the plan sound? I made that point in my letter IN 8 probably, where I said, you've suggested a lot of new main mods that I didn't ask for and didn't know. You're going to have to tell me why they're necessary. In the main, the hearing matters statements say, well, we don't think they are necessary. So where does that leave me? Because you've agreed them. Sometimes it might be more pertinent than others. and I think there's a couple of areas where you've agreed things where I will have to. But are we considering? I mean, should I be ignoring these for the time being until such time as I determine they're necessary? Is that so it put me in quite a difficult position, because it's not normal for the council to suggest main modifications and then tell me actually we don't think they're necessary anyway.
No, sir. I think the intention was that to ensure that you understood that we considered that we had a sound policy as in terms of what was there without the modifications, ensured that the substance of those modifications, the substance of the allocations, the substance of the identification of appropriate uses, those in principle elements were sound in their nature, and you didn't need to have those other elements to make sure that this was a sound allocation. But as to the appropriateness of bringing forward those particular elements, they lead to something that is more refined than the baseline approach that we took in the unmodified version. So you're able to reach the conclusion that those aren't actually necessary for the sake of soundness. We wanted to be protective, I think, is probably the best way to describe our response, so that we tried to give as much as we could to make sure that the allocations did what they were supposed to.
Okay. Quite a few of these what I'm going to call the TFL modifications are fairly generic. They say the same thing in every one, and if they are necessary, I question whether you need it in every policy, or is it a generic policy requirement to promote these things. Council's obviously agreed with TFL that these are, if not necessary for soundness, then but clearly the council is still agreed that they are correct, shall we say. So where I guess the council is saying, well, major strip generating uses your development should be limited, should limit major strip generating uses, etc. Even if they, well, we don't think it's necessary, but you obviously agree with it. So should I be taking it that you agree then that there are deficiencies, for want of a better word, in where the site is in terms of sustainable access? So if
it's not that we think that in some way that there is a deficiency that needs to be overcome, but what TFL were wanting was to make sure there was prioritisation in the way that they've identified, and we wanted to accommodate that element. From one perspective, we could have reached the conclusion, well, these are minor modifications, because all they're doing is actually just describing another aspect that needs to come forward with regard to them. But the difficulty with going forward with a minor modification is that there are different consultation requirements, or rather, there wouldn't be the same sort of consultation requirements associated with them, and it would be much more sensible and protective if we put them forward in the way that we have done as main modifications.
Okay. As I say, I think where some of the points are quite generic, covered generically, there are some very site-specific issues, I think, which I'll come on to, and you'll be able to tell me why you've agreed with the TFL, but does it highlight a particular problem? I mean, for example, and it's quite difficult for me now because they're before me. They're obviously before everybody else, so people might wish to raise them. You tell me they're not really necessary, so I could in theory just say, well, actually, I'm not going to discuss these. I can take them away with me perhaps and decide on reflection whether or not any actions are needed. I mean, in this case, it's all about generally limiting. Major strip uses should contribute to improving public transport connectivity by exploring opportunities for targeted bus service enhancements. That becomes a requirement. Is that actually? I suppose the other question is the council must have presumably satisfied itself that's achievable. Is that?
Well, perhaps Dr. Jones can answer whether that has actually been decided upon. I'll say I'll hold my tongue until then.
Yeah, because I have to assume it's been agreed for a reason, and that you accept it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think in that instance it was TfL's view that bus service improvement would be essential to aiding this, aiding a shift over to sustainable transport modes. So that's why we decided it was wise to include that as a proposed modification.
But if that's essential, again, the logical inference is, it's not unusual. Again, sorry, it's not unusual for a development and allocation to result in the need for public transport improvements. In fact, it might well be set out in your transport policies anyway. I suppose the question is, does that imply there is some kind of problem with this site being inaccessible that needs to be addressed? And that's not to say you can't allocate it. But if there is an issue that needs to be mitigated, the TfL needs to be mitigated. The question is, is it actually mitigatable? Can you do that? Is the scale of development sufficient to actually deliver those improvements?
Yeah, that's why I think I'll draw your attention to the wording, the words exploring opportunities, because we're conscious in discussions with TfL that we didn't want to kind of craft site allocation requirements around any particular potential development proposal. I think development for outdoor sport and recreation combined with nature recovery use there could be kind of a number of forms of development that could take, and so I think that's why it was important to talk about exploring opportunities with the strategic plan, with the Strategic Transport Authority, what would be appropriate for any particular development proposal.
Okay, in theory, again, you could, if an application comes forward, explore opportunities. Always, it's a little bit, again, ambiguous, isn't it? Is it actually what you're seeking to achieve? Is an adequate level of public transport and accessibility? And if the development doesn't achieve that, then that could be a reason that you might look unfavourably at it. Is that I'm always keen to understand what you're actually trying to achieve, and explore opportunities is a bit. It's a bit vague.
I think we could have been more precise in the wording if we had a specific quantum of development that we were setting out to achieve from that site. But in this instance, we're not, because it's, as I say, it's nature recovery plus outdoor sport and recreation, which could lead to different kind of permutations of development that would have very different transport needs and requirements.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, right. I'm not going to talk any more about those modifications. I think some of these I'm going to take away, and if you're content for me to come back, where I think it's very important for me to talk about, I'll raise it. If I think it's generic points, if you're content for me to come back in the fullness of time with a view on all of these, then
yes, please. That would be very helpful. It certainly would make the process of the modification process more efficient.
Yeah. Finally, I think criterion E. I've only got a question. No. Sorry, two points. Criterion E. Must respond sensitively to. What does that mean? Do you actually mean will not cause unacceptable harm to, or not cause significant harm to, or do you want to would it be preferable to cross-reference to your heritage policies?
I think in terms of responding sensitively, I think if I was kind of crafting a development proposal and I read this, then the first thing I would do would go to the kind of heritage evidence base and look at what those particular qualities are, and then think about how how to respond to those without kind of causing any harm or or any kind of unacceptable impact on the locally listed landscape. But on reflection, it would be helpful, I think, to decision makers and those bringing forward development proposals to kind of cross-reference there to relevant heritage policies in the plan.
There are several hundred criteria, I'm bound to miss one or two. But my general rule of thumb is say what you want. You know, don't sort of have a think about it and do this. No, what do you want? You want development to not cause harm, presumably. And that's what national policy says anyway. So it seems a bit, okay, okay, and then criterion G might be the same sort of thing. Yes, the same thing, is it must respond sensitively to important local views. Yes. What does that mean? You know, you mean, well, if you mean adhere to our local view policy, then that's actually clearer, I think, than respond sensitively to. Is that a fair? I don't know. You may disagree with me.
And I think that probably those sorts of changes, if those are changes that need to happen to the Appendix C entries, we can do that under the minor modification procedures rather than have that as a main modification, because all that is happening is that it's properly reflecting the policies in question.
Oh, something to think about. One thing, again, so for everyone here, you've raised it. My practice tends to be that if a policy is changing with a main modification, it's logical to include the additional modification within that, because otherwise it gets very confusing for people when there's a main modification, you'll have consultation, then the policy ends up being different. So
Understood.
We make it very clear that not every single, but it just makes it clearer, I think, for everyone that it's how the policy will change. My report will reflect on what is absolutely necessary. But I mean, hopefully there won't be too many of those. And I don't mean that for every single typo, but yeah.
Understood. So we'll take that approach in that case and wait for that.
But I'd advise on that. And then I think I've talked about the mods. Yeah, so N and O, there were two new criteria in the design principles, but N and O, to me, they're both actually covered by other transport policies anyway, and would be necessary anyway, so I'm not sure they're absolutely necessary, unless we go down the approach of belt and braces for everything. Okay, really sorry, that was very long, I do apologise, but it's important for me to get what I need out of it, hopefully addressing as many points as I can as well that people raised. Is there anything, I mean, have I bored you to submission, or is there anything that you want to raise that you haven't been able to or don't feel?
On 7.
Yeah, I think now we've gone past the generic greenbelt issues on 7. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I would like to. I believe yesterday in your opening remarks you had said you hadn't yet done any site visits. Is that right?
I've done some. When I get to the end of this, I will be asking about.
Because I would like to draw your attention to public right-of-way 332, which runs south from Whitewebbs Lane, approximately a quarter of a mile east of this site that we've been currently discussing today. The footpath is about 3/4 of a mile long. It's signposted to Balls Cross, and for about the first quarter of a mile it runs past the existing Spurs ground, where you'll get a view of the sort of potential development that might come forward on this site. Thank you.
Thank you. It is helpful. Yeah, if anyone is this, I mean, yes, you were here. I didn't say about site visits. If there's, it's not unhelpful if somebody says there's a particular part of the site they think it'd be useful for me to see, and also if there's any parts of the site I can't see from the public domain, just so I'm aware of it. But yes, thank you. Thank you. That's helpful. Councillor Fox.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you. Is it okay to talk about the general points that have also been covered?
Yeah. Pick up the points you wish to. I mean,
Yeah.
don't repeat. If I've covered it, you don't need to tell me again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd say that the allocation of RUI 7 is fundamentally unsound due to the council's failure to undertake a site-specific assessment of the Greenbelt, as acknowledged in the evidence base. And if one looks at the national planning policy, which requires that any development on the Greenbelt must preserve its openness and not conflict with its purposes, I think the plan makes no attempts to demonstrate exceptional circumstance for allocating the site, nor does it access whether the proposed development falls within the narrow definition of appropriate use in the Greenbelt. Furthermore, I think the absence of this assessment, the allocation is legally and procedurally flawed. I think a local plan must really be consistent with a national policy to be sound. And in this case, I think it's demonstratively not. And I think, moving on, significant built form is incompatible with Greenbelt aims. So if one looks at the stated intent is for nature recovery and community sport uses, the plan also permits professional sport and ancillary facilities, which implies permanent large-scale built development. And I think this directly threatens the openness of the Greenbelt, and of someone who's been up there many times myself, I think this would undermine the fundamental characteristic of the area. Moving on, I'll go very quick. The NPPF 150 to 151, even appropriate facilities for sport and recreation must preserve openness, and I think here no such preservation is demonstrated. I think that's pretty much it. I would also say that I think on the location is pure. I know we covered this a little bit. The location is is poorly served by public transport, which I think is a major concern. And I think there's no robust evidence that the council has fully assessed, I'm afraid, the flood risk, groundwater sensitivity, or land stability. And I think also that overall, I've got a lot of great concerns. But I'll leave it there because I don't want to obviously go on too long. Thank you very much.
No, you must say what you want to say. Thank you. To a point. You should. Well, the main point is that you shouldn't leave here wishing you'd said something you haven't, because you will not have an opportunity to say it again. But thank you for those points. And sorry, Friends of Whitewebbs. Sorry. And
Friends of Whitewebbs.
Road
Yes.
Watch et al. I believe.
Yes. I'm trying to dislocate my mind from what we've seen is proposed there and from the general principles. It's a bit difficult, but I think we would say that professional sport development in the area is totally incompatible because of the nature of professional sport development. The requirements of that, as I understand it, are quite exacting in terms of facilities, the quality and nature of pitches, the fact that pitches would have to be level, I understand. I'm not that good at football, but I understand that it's customary for them to be level rather than on a undulating land. If this is correct, then the whole character of the landscape would change. The area was bought for the people of Enfield by Middlesex County Council because it was one of the most beautiful areas of the county, and inherent in that is the characteristic of the land, which is open space, long vistas. It was a 19th century parkland, open, long vistas, undulating landscape, and this is very much on the heritage side, on the biodiversity side as well, and this was encouraged. If this were to be developed for professional sport, which, as I understand it, involves discretion on the part of we've seen on the current site for the men's training ground, very high fencing, complete blocking of views. They don't want poaching of their players or sight of their players. So it will be like something like an industrial fortress for football. And I don't see how that is compatible with openness of Greenbelt. I would add that Whitewebbs is the absolute epitome of Greenbelt land. One other thing about it is that not all Greenbelt is open access. In fact, I understand that I've seen various estimates, between 13 and 25%. In Enfield, my rough calculations are that about 20% of the Greenbelt land is actually open access to the general public. And any encroachment on that by a large-scale development for, say, professional sport would seriously diminish the amount of open space available. There is so much. I wish I'd brought a KC with me to understand the complications. On the biodiversity side, we have biodiversity. We're between two sinks, and it's a pathway for us. And one thing that is forgotten is that when the golf course was closed, it had been managed in such a way that nature recovery was very, very fast indeed. And a survey 3 years ago would bear very little relationship to the survey this morning. I couldn't move for meadow browns charging around the entire open area. And this changes day by day, month by month.
Sorry, just on that, is your point then that the evidence that was used to justify the allocation is now effectively out of date?
It's out of date.
Okay.
Nature, I read in something, I've got some quote that nature recovery can happen so quickly and is it's almost exponential. We have evidence on site of that anyway. The other thing about a proposal to enhance, and I have no idea what enhance means. It's been used frequently in council documents. Enhance, in this case, to make up for any BNG damage, because a large area of, let's take, for example, football pitches, is, as far as insect life is concerned, is a barren waste, that we have 11 species of bat in the area. And while there is a proposal, I have heard that there might be a proposal to put a few bat boxes up, that doesn't help when you've destroyed the feeding ground for the bats. And the bats need a vast acreage or hectareage of land for feeding. We're destroying, so the openness is not just a matter of space, it is a matter of quality for biodiversity.
Thank you. I mean, this goes back really to my first point, I suppose, and the point the council's sort of been making, I think, is that some of the things you're obviously, some of your concerns are potentially dependent on the final nature of any application. Very difficult, I understand, because you are probably more understanding of the application than I am, and I don't want to get into it. But in terms of the allocation, I suppose the question would be, does, in the policy, the development requirements, is there anything that you would want to see, other than be deallocated? I understand that probably. Is there anything you want to see in the policy that would help to address your concerns on those impacts?
Yes.
Could there be main modifications which would actually provide you with some comfort? I'm not saying there would be.
The only modification I can think of would be a requirement, would be a change in the use of the professional sport. I can't think of any professional sport apart from golf, and I hold no brief for reintroducing golf, or possibly cross-country horse riding or something like that. I cannot see any sport that could use Whitewebbs Park without creating a hideous amount of damage to heritage, character, biodiversity, and anything else you care to name, and public access to open space.
Thank you. It's helpful, thank you very much. Okay.
If I think of something else,
I
think I've covered.
Probably not, because I'm sure everyone's really quite angry with me for carrying on until this time, but we will get through to the end of this one. Obviously, from the Conservative group,
if it's a no, that's okay.
Is it a different point?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it would have been better if it could have been made before, but never mind.
No, look, in order to speed up the process, I'm happy not to.
Is it a point that's not been raised at all?
Yes.
Well then, make it.
So it mainly revolves around the nature of the site itself with regard to north and south. So I appreciate what you're saying, that we're not, and I'm not extolling the positives or the negatives of the planning application that we've had. But my point being is the outline itself, from your approach and the pronouncements that you've made, this could be made sounder by effectively restricting the outline to just the Totenham site, because there is no need with regard to biodiversity to expand the whole site south that they've already been given planning permission for. There's no need for it. The council owns that land. They can do what they want with that land. So therefore, their arguments with regard to the biodiversity, it doesn't need to happen. You don't have to rely on an outside developer, or in this instance, a sports team, to do that for you. And I'd also make on the point covered public access. On the final point with regard to buses, that I think has been taken out of context with regard to TfL and the other sites relating to this one. TfL have caused roadblocks throughout this process on Cruise Hill and Vicarage Farm. Whitewebbs is acknowledged to be inaccessible, and all of a sudden we're being led to believe by the council and TfL that all of a sudden increased public services in terms of transport provision will suddenly magic out of somewhere in order to make this site more viable and sound. So I don't see why that logic applies to Whitewebbs Park and not to the other sites as well. So those were the points which I think haven't been addressed yet, and I'll leave it there.
On the issue of the boundary, site allocation boundary, and what is currently in use as sports and what isn't, is there anything? Can you point me to somewhere in the evidence base where that would be clear, so I can at least understand the relationship? Is there any? Because it's not in the inset, is it? I'm not sure I've seen anything in topic papers.
So sorry, were you referring to the ownership side of the?
Well, the existing uses.
The uses.
Yeah. If the allocation includes,
No.
if the allocation's already partly in use for this, and the remainder is where you expect the nature recovery uses to be. I suppose that, again, it comes back to my original point, but what's the allocation for, and understanding that and the extent of it. And so,
yes.
To be fair, I didn't ask a question about whether the boundary is suitable or not, but it's been raised.
I'll be corrected, sir, but I think that the only indication is in RUR7 as to the site boundary, and it doesn't give any greater clarity as to what uses are made up within the boundary of the site.
Okay. I mean, can I access everything I need to? I mean, presumably not. If some of it's already in professional sports use, that's presumably off limits. But would I be able to, from the public domain, would I be able to see what that relationship is? I'm probably looking at Quod as well.
Be corrected, but in terms of views of the facility, so the existing facilities, you should be able to gain sight of those as to the locations. I understand that you'll be able to see those on site. As to actually seeing the site, obviously, Mr. Bainan is here. He perhaps can speak to the ability for you to see the site itself.
Okay. Ms. Lack.
Yes, I'm going to ask a question which I know protocol won't allow you to answer, but I'm afraid I have to ask this. I am thoroughly...
You really don't have to.
I know I do, because I'm thoroughly confused about the conversation today. You have been asking questions around the policy as presented in the local plan and making suggestions about how it may be more effective. And yet an application has already been made to the council, and decision makers within the council have already passed it. So I'm really confused about the juxtaposition of these two events.
Well, I thought I'd explain that. The plan application's nothing to do with me.
Yep.
I'm examining the plan as submitted. And that's it. It's not unusual, frankly. Some people might find it extremely frustrating. Our planning applications come in on sites which are in emerging local plans. It comes with every single examination. Why has this site got planning permission when it's in local plan? Well, that's nothing. I can't do it. What would you like me to do about it? I can't do anything about it. So it's absolutely outside my control. It might seem moot to many people that we're having this discussion about an allocation, but the point is, if that application was to lapse or permission were to lapse, and another application comes in, then this is the plan that has to be, it has to be considered against this plan. So if the scheme happens, and this policy is never triggered at all, well, then that's just life, I'm afraid. It's nothing. Literally, there's nothing I can do about it. So it is an unusual situation. You might think it's a bit strange I'm having this discussion, but my interest is in what's in the plan and what's before me, not what decisions the council have made out with the plan. It's just how it is, unfortunately. So yeah, sorry, not much I can do about it. Similarly, I can't say, if you were to tell me, well, this application has this feature, and that's contrary to criterion E. Well, again, and even if that is the case, what can I do about it? Because I'm only assessing whether criterion E is appropriate or not. And you would presumably tell me, not criterion, but criterion E is exactly right, because criterion E might well say, should be sensitive to development and so on and so on. It's absolutely the right criteria. The decision making, actually, because once I've gone, lots of decisions are going to be made against this plan, which I'm having to bear it, so it's just in the same place. So it is unusual. You might say the last 2 hours have been a very strange conversation because we're doing, but yeah, that's just how the planning system works, unfortunately. So, sorry, but again, is that anything else you want to say about that? There's nothing else I can do about it. Thank you. We'll get your points and then get to the council. Then we really must have a break. I do apologise.
Thank you, sir. I had two very quick points before I do. I just wanted to come back to you on the sort of established boundaries and things at the moment. So within the allocation boundary, there are, at the moment, public and private areas. The club's training centre being one, which is enclosed and private. However, that's subject to change in the future with future development. Both through extant planning permissions and the one I mentioned earlier, which has a resolution to grant. It's been our intention of the policy. It's flexible in terms of the range of uses it proposes. It recognises the principles of all of the different types of uses and allows schemes to come forward and be assessed on their own individual merits as the statutory decision-making process allows them to do so. So it's not our understanding or suggestion that the site is demarcated into particular areas. Just jumping back to the 2 points I wanted to pick up on. One, just to clarify the ancient woodland piece, if it's helpful. The northwest part of the allocation is designated as ancient woodland. That was deliberately in the planning application, the same reason it's in the site allocation at the moment. It's part of the wider public accessibility improvements which the planning application proposed and which can feed through into the allocation. So it included new pedestrian routes through the woodland, it included Whitewebbs Pond, which was upgraded, and the very northwest of the allocation also includes the Grade 2 listed North Lodge, which can link back to the heritage benefits of the allocation as well. And the second point was the must be should point, and just to add further to that, because we've got some slight concerns around some of the design principles which go to the principles of soundness, I think. So I think two concerns on the must be should issue, and we've set out in our written statement how we think from our perspective we would recommend they are modified. Firstly, I think some of the design principles prejudge the requirements of a scheme, things which could or possibly be secured through Section 106 and/or planning conditions. They would have to go through the necessary legal tests to be found appropriate to a scale of development that's proposed. So, for example, must provide streetscape improvements under item H, or must improve north, south and east-west pedestrian connections under I. I think those needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, just to use 2 examples. And secondly, to follow and link to that point, it doesn't reflect different scales of development. Not all criteria would apply to every type of development that comes forward in this allocation. It could be small-scale development, for example, which I mentioned earlier, or it could be major proposals where they would all apply equally. So I think there needs to be some recognition in there that, under the must-be should point, not all apply equally to every single scheme. Thank you.
Okay. So was it H and I or J? Oh, so this H and J both talk about streetscape improvements. So is only H you're worried about, or is
No, we have sort of suggested modifications to a lot of the design principles. So I think I cited H and I just as 2 examples.
Okay.
For example, H must provide streetscape improvements, and I must improve north, south, and east, west pedestrian and cycle connections. I think the principles of my point apply across the across all of the design principles. I think without wanting to slow the session down.
I can again comes up a lot when you've got an allocation which says must deliver junction improvement at X, and the often argument is subject to silt regs and everything else. There'll be a TA and so on. We determine whether that's actually necessary or not. It might be tweaked to say if necessary, provide that. But I'd have thought that streetscape improvements, that's a fairly that's a recognition of what you might expect most development. It's sort of what you expect. What do you need to deliver to make the scheme acceptable? And presumably part of that is in design terms and layout terms. And that streetscape improvements aren't a mitigation for transport. They're not a mitigation for. They don't fall into SIL, do they? In that respect, they're not a mitigation time. They are what makes the scheme acceptable from a design perspective. Without those streetscape improvements, it may be that it's not acceptable because you're not delivering a suitable form of development. So I'm not sure I necessarily accept the premise.
I don't disagree in principle, sir. I think from our point of view, we deal with all different types of scales of development across the allocation. I think it's about making sure that if streetscape improvements are to be delivered, they're necessary and appropriate and proportionate to a scheme. So, for example, we have a live application at the moment to propose an extension to a small-scale extension to the existing training centre. It wouldn't necessarily deliver any publicly facing streetscape improvements. It's self-contained within an enclosed site which isn't publicly visible, whereas the application of this would suggest we have to do it, and it could be used as a reason to suggest non-policy compliance.
Yeah, I suppose this is where it comes again down to the policy reads to me as if we're talking about a comprehensive form of this isn't a sort of area-based approach where we say any application that comes forward in this area will have to be determined. This seems to me saying we're expecting this sort of comprehensive form of development, greenbelt. You know what I mean? It's a scheme. What you're saying, but actually it's about piecemeal applications coming forward. So it's more of an area-based approach than an allocation, really. I'd say like the PL, one of the PL policies. But I'll bear that in mind. Thank you. So very quickly. Is there anything you want to come back on?
Just on the modifications, the approach taken by THFC are a little more than just saying, well, it's only when it's necessary and practicable, because it's also subject to ownership and legal restrictions. So it's actually really rather caveated, and we would say that it's important that there's a strategic approach to the site as a whole. We are looking at comprehensive proposals that will achieve the aims in question under the allocation. So it'd be quite right to make sure that what's delivered is seen in a comprehensive by way of a comprehensive approach and not on a piecemeal basis, which is what's suggested.
And then just on a couple of matters of principle, the particular one being that the by definition, professional sport, the approach we've talked about, we don't know what the impact's going to be until something comes in. But the point's been made that professional sport not predetermined, there's an expectation of what a certain landform will be, and that will definitely have some negative impact on local landscape and so on.
I was going to potentially respond to what Mr. Wilkinson said, but actually, if you look at the allocation, and if you look at CL4, it doesn't refer to football. Mr. Wilkinson's point was solely about football, whereas what is identified is the delivery of professional sport. Mr. Wilkinson's point was only about the inevitability of football, not about all other. In fact, I think he said that other sports didn't have that potentiality. Now, so I'm not going to, it may be suggested that I'm dancing on a pinhead because of the nature of the application, and so I won't look at it on that basis. I still maintain that how one looks at this proposal depends very much on the application, and that's precisely why there needs to be the flexibility.
I think in that respect, what I need to do, taking on board everyone's comments, is again, I will take away all these comments and look at those criteria A to M and determine whether or not I consider them to be effective in providing an appropriate framework. I've been told it's an appropriate framework. Obviously, for me to assess whether it's an appropriate framework and whether anything needs to be done. Do you want to come back on that point?
I want to avoid being cross-examined by Mr. Reid, but I did point out that I gave that as an example, and most sports requiring flat surfaces, but there were very few sports that that could exist on land that undulated. I wanted to make a general point about public access, and it was suggested by I think Dr. Jones that there was very limited public access. Essentially, the golf course was a public golf course, very much on a sort of like a big pitch and putt, to which anybody in the country could come along and have access. So it had access very much as any sort of modestly priced activity in a park could be described as access, and one would not want to see them just destroy it, taking as precedence for paid land or paid access or restricted access because of that. So there's...
sorry, just on that, Council, come back on. Sorry, I just want to just make a point there. I think the answer, the point was, and this will be, again, I've got to think about the link between what I'm told and what the policy says, is that the expectation is that public access will increase.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So if the policy doesn't say that...
Sorry, I missed what you said.
The point was made to me earlier that the expectation is that public access across the site will increase.
Well, can I counter? I can counter that by saying that public access was, if one took the usage of the golf course as a rough estimate, 75,000 hours a year. These are rough figures. On estimates that we've done on usage of the park and based on several factors, we think there's at least 150,000 hours of access to the park now, much greater than was under the golf course, in terms of people walking there and using it, and considerably more than is anticipated for community use under some proposals I've seen elsewhere. Could I just refer you to the... you did mention SYNC earlier, and there was a paper submitted, I believe, from Mark Saunders, which pointed to serious deficiencies in SYNC assessment of the Whitewebbs site, which has strong evidence supporting it, and I want to draw that to your attention even more than Mark Saunders has done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Some of those points, I think, I'm obviously aware of all these points. I note of all these. I think they all link in, unless there's something specific, they all link to some of the points we discussed. And I will go away and give some thought to how it all fits together, and obviously including going on site and seeing these things for myself where I can. So is there anything else you want to say?
No, thank you very much, sir, unless Dr. Jones says.
No. So thank you. I really do apologise. I'm a little bit of a machine. I can carry on as long as need be, but I expect we've gone on a lot longer than anticipated, but I do rather like to get these things out of the way in one go. So we'll have a quarter of an hour break now, come back at 4:30 to deal with, thank you for your patience, deal with the other sites, and we'll try and get those done now, because I think a lot of what we've just discussed actually applies to those sites anyway. So it'll be more about, I think, dealing with the development requirements and sort of those issues rather than the green belt. I think I can take it as read, unless somebody wants to make something specific, that those same points I raised apply to these two sites as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's how we've taken it, sir.
Okay, so if we can adjourn now and come back at 4:30. Thank you. And if you are leaving, thank you for your time contributions. But
so could I just say that it would be certainly our preference to try, if we can, to get through the next two sites, if you're content to do that, because of the need to get through RUR2, obviously in order to.
Yes, we will definitely do that. If it goes slightly over 5:30, then if anyone's, I'm all right with that.
Thank you very much.
I think my record is 7 o'clock. We won't be doing that. So.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
RUR06, London Pickets lock. My questions. Again, I'll start with, and again, thank you for your patience. I'll start with my remaining green belt points, but I say we take some of those other things as read. I've got some specific questions about the site, but some of the other points about, in principle, those issues around openness and so on and so forth, I think are. If you don't want, unless there's something you particularly want to raise, I'll take it.
There was just one point I wanted to perhaps flag up that I didn't emphasise as much as perhaps I could have done, and that concerns the interrelationship, particularly on Whitewebbs, but it's a general point anyway, the interrelationship between what could be developed on the site and the benefits associated with the delivery of certain beneficial uses to the green belt. In the context of Whitewebbs, of course, it is the nature recovery elements that provide what I think is fair to note as an additionality that just wouldn't be capable of being obviously recognised without having a policy that dictated that comprehensiveness.
Okay. I've got that point.
As long as you've got that point,
I'm slightly conscious of the fact that obviously everyone. Whitewebbs has left out.
It's simply a repetition of that which I've said already, but I wanted to emphasise it, that's all.
Okay. So, first off, there's just a little bit of just context, and my point still applies about not getting into planning applications or anything, or merits or otherwise. But I did know, I just to understand where we are in context-wise, the hearing statement refers to a planning application. I don't think it had been validated when the statement was submitted, so I'm assuming a decision hasn't been made, but just for context, I mean, it's kind of moot anyway, but I think it just allows me to understand where things are. There is a specific point I'd asked about Greenbelt here, which is the allocation refers to existing uses, including cinema, golf course, campsite and adjacent land, including car park. And obviously you've put forward a modification to refer to the Lee Valley Leisure Centre. And so I just asked whether all of those uses are in the Greenbelt or not, and your answer indicated that all of the uses are within the Greenbelt already, so it's been washed over at some point. Obviously I don't know the context whether that was allowed with very special circumstances or is just a historical accident or what have you. But the inset map, and this might be something else, the inset map, as far as I can tell, it's got an area of green, it's got a red line around it, and then there's the green, which I assume is Greenbelt, and then there's an area of built form within the red line, which is not in the Greenbelt. So, can you just clarify, is all of the allocation in the Greenbelt or not? And is the inset map accurate or not?
Thank you. Yeah, I can confirm that all the uses are in the greenbelt.
Is all of the allocation in the greenbelt?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So is the inset map wrong?
Yeah, looking at the inset map, I can see it's confusingly marked up, so that we could address that through a modification if you'd require that, sir, yes.
Okay. And you said one of my questions was, are the existing uses all intended to be redeveloped or part of any proposed redevelopment? And you said that the extent to which existing uses will be redeveloped is dependent on nature of proposals coming forward. Yes, I suppose. But going back, I mean, in the terms of specifics of this case, unlike, say, the last site, if a significant proportion, in terms of the point about effect on openness, if the point is you're expecting the new sports, leisure and recreation facilities to replace or what is already there, that might mean that it's not going to affect openness. But if you're expecting those existing uses to already be there, to remain in place and then add to them, then it's likely we go back to it's quite likely that it will be an appropriate development in the Greenbelt. I don't want to get into all that again, but I'm more thinking about, again, is the council on this site is the expectation that it's going to be a redevelopment scheme of existing uses, or is it existing uses remain in place and will add to those uses through other forms of development?
The site allocation's been worded flexibly, so it could accommodate either of those scenarios. So.
Some would say flexibly, some would say ambiguously.
It's the same point that applies directly with Whitewebbs in that sense.
Okay, I'll just say, as a matter of, so there's no misunderstanding, clearly I raised some concerns about that approach in terms of the other side and the whether or not it's clear and unambiguous and effective to have that level of flexibility, should we call it, in regard to greenbelt purposes. But unless obviously anyone wants to raise anything more on that, I'll leave that there. But just beware, I'm not. There's more I could go into, but I think we've had the discussion.
So yes, it's noted, and there are, of course, solutions that can be adopted in order to deal with that issue. As to whether they need to be engaged with, one of the questions is whether it should be removed from the greenbelt. But as I say, the important point for that I should say is a separate issue as to whether or not it needs to come out of the greenbelt. That is a matter of judgment. There's no reason why it should do in circumstances where there's a very large area. But that's different from what I see as, or what I anticipate is what you're concerned about, which is should there be a more directional approach to how you look at the amount of development going on.
Yeah, I think I find it surprising that the council has taken the view. Sorry, I say you know what I mean. But council has taken the view that it's allocating land in the greenbelt and has given no indication at all about what it expects.
Yes.
And that it's taking what it considers to be a flexible approach. Now, I think in some cases a flexible approach is very logical. If you've got certain, but this is the greenbelt. It's a higher bar altogether, isn't it, for what is considered acceptable? And so I'm surprised. I'm also surprised that when asked, what is it you're actually proposing on this site in terms of the allocation, you don't really know. And we'll wait and see. Well, it doesn't seem logical because you've allocated it. So you must have had an inkling that you wanted something to happen on this site. You wouldn't have allocated it. So you must have had some view as to expecting something to come forward of a certain nature in order to get to the point where you've allocated site. Otherwise, you'd just put a red line around the whole of the greenbelt and say, sports and recreation uses coming. So you must have known, there must be some expectation about what's going to come forward. So I find it very surprising, shall we say, that the plan isn't more explicit in the Greenbelt about what it expects and what it considers to be acceptable or not acceptable, or how it will take into account openness or those things. To be relatively silent on that, I think, is a surprising element to me. But I've heard what you've had to say about why you consider that to be a sound approach. I will take that away with me and decide whether my surprise leads to modifications or not.
I will take it so that your indication of surprise is not an invitation for me to start responding in the way that I've already responded.
No, I'm reiterating what my surprise was, and
yes,
you've challenged me, I guess, to say, well, okay, you needn't be concerned, I guess, is your answer. So yeah, and
that's right, sir. We say that it's sufficiently effective is the point.
So most of those points are what I've raised before. I do know, again, this is a specific point on this site, but it is related back to this point. Lee Valley's statement says that they recognise they will need to demonstrate very special circumstances, which I think is quite telling. You know, there's obviously an expectation, the expectation that development is going to not be in line with the framework, and that it is going to be inappropriate, and it is therefore, by definition, going to be harmful.
Yes, can I just say one other thing, which is that, and it does highlight this point, which is that another way of looking at the appropriateness of the allocation is what would be the effect of removing this allocation from the plan. And all that would happen is that there would be an absence of encouragement, which has a particular resonance with regard to the last site that I won't go back to, but an encouragement for particular forms of development on a site. And that can only but be harmful to the overall proper planning of the area. So it may not be as specific as it could be, but it does provide that degree of benefit that, in the absence of it being within the plan, it will be a deficiency.
But are the benefits here, which are different, I assume, to the benefits of the last site, are the benefits here, there's nothing mentioned about nature recovery. I don't want to get too involved in what's being proposed through an application, but my understanding from the statements is that it's a large it's a large recreation, facility, leisure use, effectively. So yes, that might well be economic benefits that the council might determine in any application that very special circumstances exist to allow it. But there is inherently, in my mind, a difference between a plan promoting uses which are I suppose should the plan be honest about where it is? We are actively promoting development which is harmful, which we accept will be harmful to the Greenbelt, and in determining whether or not it is acceptable, these are the things that we're expecting to see delivered to justify that harm. I think at the moment I have a kind of it all reads very no harm. There's no indication what's actually going to happen. It gives me no clue, and that's sorry. I don't keep harping on about. I don't want to, but that's where I keep being led back to. There's this.
Yes, I think that the CL4 is important in understanding the relationship between, or in understanding the purpose of the allocation. So it may be worthwhile just looking at that very briefly. It's page 312 of the plan.
Yes.
And that's a positive policy in relation to what it says, promoting sporting excellence. But it says development and investment, this is at 1, that align with the objective of the Enfield health and wellbeing strategy will be supported, particularly when they align with the following criteria. And then B is they facilitate and contribute towards the development of first-class publicly accessible strategic sport and leisure facilities to meet the needs of the growing population based on the following hierarchy of priority locations shown on the policies map, including, and Pickets Lock is identified as one of them. And that's providing then a context, a positive context, within which one will look at Pickets Lock. And one approach could have been to to say, well, it will be developed for these sorts of facilities. But that's not the overarching policy context. The overarching policy context is the delivery of sporting facilities of some kind, whatever form they may take. So that whilst one could have had a specific allocation policy that dealt with a specific kind of development, that's not the only form in which a positively prepared policy could take in order to deliver the aims of CL4. So it would be, as I say, presumptuous from one perspective just to identify a particular kind of development when there may be one or more forms that the development could take. So,
but looking at it from the other way, the policy could have said what wouldn't be.
it could have done.
Because sports and recreation facilities, it's a broad church, isn't it? You know, it's a very wide range of things, and one would assume that in meeting what's in CL4, some of those uses would be more likely to meet that than others.
Yes.
I don't know if somebody wanted, I don't know, I want to cast aspersions, but because who knows, I might say something that is being proposed. But there might be certain types of recreation where you think, well, actually, that's not going to be meeting CL4, so we want to guide people away from that. Now, you might argue, well, you don't need to do that, I'm fine. That's for me to think about.
I anticipate Dr. Jones will say otherwise, but I anticipate that the reason that you wouldn't need to go down the route of identifying all that is inappropriate is that it is under the aegis of the authority. It will be delivering certain types of development that are consistent with what's been going on there in any event, so that it would be better to rely on the reasonableness of the authority in terms of what it brings forward. So you don't need to start defining it in a negative sense. You give the options, you allow the options, and then provide a framework within which they'll be considered.
Okay.
In short, so one shouldn't be presuming what the final result is going to be.
Never assume, never presume.
Quite.
Okay. Okay. I've got things to think about on that. Just checking all my other questions are more generic in nature. Presumably the same principle applies on this one, though, that there's no expectation that VSC has been predetermined. That's when same principle.
The same modifications will be engaged as well.
Okay. The one thing I just wanted to check on, again from an openness greenbelt perspective, it is specific to this site. Criteria A and B require delivery of new connections. At least one east-west publicly accessible connection across the site, and feasibility, in B, of delivery of a new connection over Meridian Way, etc. Would such things, again, as a matter of principle, affect openness, or would these just be they fit into essential infrastructure and therefore be acceptable?
Are those? Are you asking about the effect on openness of new connections?
Yeah, I mean, basically, again, new infrastructure within the greenbelt is that, and that's not dependent on an application. That's like any application's got to deliver these things. So again, have you considered the effect on openness or the effect on greenbelt openness? Do you have to? Do you need to? In that respect,
I think that would depend on the kind of exact nature of connections that come forward. I think what this design principles intends to do is to address the long-standing issue of east-west connectivity in that part of the borough, which is sorely lacking. So the idea is, from this site allocation, to use the opportunity to improve those east-west connections. It's not being prescriptive as to what form those connections would take. In terms of kind of practically kind of crossing Pimsbrook in terms of practically kind of crossing Meridian Way and Boundary Ditch, that would imply a bridge. That bridge would be kind of on the edge of the site. That would be possibly located kind of not within the greenbelt, so that would be a relevant consideration. But then the design principles more broadly are intended to support the existing landscape character, in particular design principle F, which requires proposals to maintain the existing sense of openness. And there are more broadly requirements around promoting nature recovery and additional tree planting and biodiversity enhancements as well that would align with green belt imperatives.
Let's just not forget that openness is not just a visual issue, it's a spatial. It's the two aspects of it. And so, you know, is there inevitability that you are, again, promoting, requiring development, which is by definition harmful to the green belt? I'm not saying that's necessarily. I want to understand, though, where we're starting from and whether that's justified or not.
Well, it's certainly not the intention of the policy to promote harmful development in a green belt setting.
Okay.
The only other point I would make is that that under 155C rather, local transport infrastructure which can demonstrate a requirement for a greenbelt location is also regarded as not inappropriate, provided it preserves openness and doesn't conflict with the purposes of including land within it. So it has the potentiality, again, to be not inappropriate.
Yeah.
Always
I'd like to see the the local transport connection, local transport infrastructure that doesn't have.
Well, I would just say a footpath.
Well, yeah. In space, well, yes, maybe so. Yeah. No, that's a fair point. Okay, that's. I think every other point is one that's been made. So, any points on Greenbelt? Yes. Well, welcome and thank you.
Hello, yes, thank you. I think our hearing statement provides background to both the Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, not Planning Authority,
All right.
just to make that clear, and to its, I think, quite unusual statutory remit as regards the regional park. Those are in paragraph 6 and 7. So our whole remit is about leisure, recreation, nature conservation, and entertainments of any kind, if you read the 1966 Act. So we do have a sort of special purpose in that sense. And it's also worth noting that most of the regional park is designated either as Greenbelt or Metropolitan Urban Land, because we stretch right down into London up to the River Thames. So this is a matter that we have to address every day in terms of delivering our remit and our duty as set out under the Act. And we are obliged under the Act to produce a park plan which sets out our proposals for the future use and development of the whole park. We own over a third of the land within the park, but there are other sorts of water bodies and areas of land that are owned by other parties. And we work closely with our statutory consultee, shall we say, or statutory partners, one of which is the London Borough of Enfield and the other riparian boroughs through which the park passes, as well as other landowners. So our plan of proposals is drawn up in consultation with those groups. It doesn't go through a local plan examination. It's something that sits outside that sort of process.
I bet you're grateful about that.
But we have in the past followed a consultation process so that another requirement of the Act can be picked up, and that is the requirement that the local planning authority through which the park passes, must include the proposals from our plan in their plans or strategies, even if they don't agree with our proposals, which is I appreciate nowadays that is a very odd position.
It's very interesting.
Yes. So, so the park was set up in the late 60s, and Pickets Lock area, the site shown in the allocation, was one of the first sites that was developed within the regional park, and a major multi-activity leisure centre was developed, and that was new. It was different from local leisure facilities, so it did serve a regional purpose at that time. And then that was followed with a public golf course, pay and play, and a campsite in the early 90s, and then we had the addition of the Odeon Lux cinema shortly after. And then in the early 2000s, the leisure centre was demolished. It had reached the end of its life, and that was sort of replaced, if you like, with the Lee Valley Athletics Centre and the outdoor running track, which again meets a sort of regional as well as a local need. And sort of scrolling through to present day, the authority is now collaborating with the Wave to bring this inland surfing venue to the regional park, to Enfield, to London. And that's going to not just be a sort of surfing facility, it's also going to be an area of public open space to the north of the surfing facility, and then other sporting outdoor activities. And you've got an image of the master plan for that in our statement, just to give you an idea of what's going on. So we are obviously supportive of the allocation that's been put forward. It's a mechanism in our mind to take forward the fact that in the current local plan, this site is allocated as a major developed site in the Greenbelt. And I think that's come off the back of the history of the site in terms of its continual development, change, and use for leisure recreational purposes in line with the regional park's remit. And at every point in that development, Greenbelt policy has been there and is indeed there for the rest of the park. So I think our hearing statement alludes to the Lee Valley Ice Centre, which is within the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and that was recently, the existing ice centre that was built in the 70s was demolished, and a new ice centre was built, a larger ice centre with some Olympic-sized skating pads, and that the case for very special circumstances was argued because that was in metropolitan open land. So yes, the allocation is helpful because it demonstrates how the local planning authority, Enfield, are incorporating our proposals within their plan, and there are other points throughout the plan where there is reference to the regional park, and indeed there is a statement of common ground between the council and ourselves where we've suggested some minor changes just to ensure that is the regional park and its proposals are properly referenced. And I think, yes, the points made about the allocation being helpful and beneficial in terms of dealing with this site, which is not that accessible to the general public at the moment. It has built form within it, different types of built form. The cinema is one sort of shape. The athletic centre is a more modern, more sympathetic potentially in terms of its greenbelt setting. And then in the northern half of the site, we've got Ponder's End Lake, which has, I think it's metropolitan importance for nature conservation. And that is something that we manage. And we have our own biodiversity action plan and our own officers that deal with nature conservation and biodiversity. So that is an important asset to the regional park, to its wildlife, and complementary to the adjacent SSSI. We are also aware of issues about improving access, and that one way potentially of doing that is this idea of a bridge over the road and the railway and into the site. Again, we are also aware that some of these footbridges can have, in terms of making them accessible to all users with the ramps that are needed, they can have an impact on openness on the green belt. But you know, that is something we would want to look at very carefully, because we clearly want to improve people's ability to get into this area, given it is I think our statement references are quite landlocked with other developments surrounding it, not that visible. And there might be future potential on the northern part of the site for flood mitigation measures. We're not sure really. This is something that we've been in discussion with Enfield. So there is good collaboration between the parties, recognising the site is in the green belt, but it's also in the regional park, so it needs to serve the purposes that the regional park was originally set up for, and for which everybody who lives in London, Essex and Hertfordshire pays for through a preset on the levy. So we are a public body, and although we don't have planning powers like a local planning authority, we are a public body. I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you. It's interesting. A couple of points. I suppose just in general, strikes me as a bit of a juxtaposition between the role of the regional park, as you've described it, and metropolitan open land and greenbelt designations. Put that to one side. And the other point was interesting. So obviously I've not necessarily come across this before. Is the how, and again, I was amused thinking out loud here about the relationship between, if the Act suggests that Enfield have to reflect your plans in their plans, what happens if an inspector comes along and says those plans are not sound? But we'll perhaps cross that bridge if and when need to. On the northern part of the site, you've explained there's a lake there which has got some. I don't think it's not identified. If it's identified as a sink in the plan, doesn't appear to be identified as such in the inset map. But if it's got, well, I suppose the main point is that, from your perspective at least, part of. Does it need to be in the allocation? I suppose if you're looking at the red line of the allocation, if that's not part of what is expected to come forward as part of the sports, leisure and recreation facilities, it might be that you can do things that anyway, flood risk mitigation, you won't need to be an allocation. If you want to improve public accessibility, you don't need to be an allocation. So I'm wondering if that is site of importance for nature conservation or has value for that anyway, does it need to be part of the allocation? Should it be in the allocation? I'm asking you. It might be a question for the council as well, but you're
yes, I mean, we sort of saw it as part of the allocation, mainly because there's also the question of improving public access to that area. It's currently part of the golf course, and at the moment will be retained, I think I'm correct in saying, as a golfing facility, and I think that land is included within the area that the Wave will be operating if they get their planning consent. So there will be a lease arrangement with the Wave, and that the area of the lake is included in that area. And I know they're looking in terms of biodiversity net gain to make improvements potentially within that area. I think I'm reluctant to see I think it's more important to have a sort of strategic overview for the whole site in terms of its master planning.
Yeah, possibly so. I mean, one thing I'm thinking of, I'm always thinking of decision makers, and the policy doesn't say we won't expect, say, built form in the northern part of the site, or we won't in the northern part of the site reserved for accessible uses or reserved for flood mitigation or anything like that. So looking at it, slightly different position because you've got a responsibility about all this. So you're not talking about necessarily a developer coming in, who's got a different role. But if that was the case, they might, well, actually, the policy doesn't say anything about that part of the site. We can do what we like up there. We can deliver our built form in that part of the site. But if that's not intended or appropriate or suitable, if not taken out of the allocation, it might still be something that, to make the policy effective, needs to be made clear. I think the more clear a policy can be about what you're actually wanting someone to do, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And so if it's misleading in any way, or open to interpretation, or is ambiguous about what is proposed or what is expected, that might be something to think about. So I'm not getting the impression that's an area. It might be part of the overall vision, but I don't get the impression that's really where anybody would expect part of this built form to be. And again, because it's greenbelt, because we're always coming back to that it's greenbelt, higher bar. As you've heard, I'm very keen for the plan to be as clear as possible. But thank you for that. Extremely useful. Does the council have any points he wants to come back? I mean, they're obviously supportive, really, so it's perhaps not much to say.
No, nothing from us, I don't think, unless Dr. Jones.
I mean, unless you want to say anything about my point there about the northern element of the site and whether or not that does need to be part of the allocation to achieve your objectives.
Dr. Jones probably have something to say about it. I'll just say that there is, at least on the face of it, and I think this chimes with the authorities' approach anyway, on the face of it, the policy is expecting a comprehensive approach towards that area, towards the site as a whole. And so it'd be sensible for it to be included on that basis.
Okay.
Dr. Jones may say so.
And also thank you. Also draw your attention to Design Principle I, which explicitly it's a must ask the developers to promote nature recovery and additional tree planting and biodiversity enhancements. So any kind of negative impact on sink would be controlled by that imperative, combined with policy BG2, which contains specific requirements for developments that could affect sinks.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Right, so we're going to move on then to the strategic issues and then also the development requirements as well. My first points are about flood risk again, because again, I think we're in the same boat as the last. Same boat as the last one. The table says flood zone 1. I believe the topic paper says flood zone 2 and 3. Don't know what might not be very significant proportions again, but I think whether or not again you need to just go and check that, or you need to check that. Yeah. It's not again. It's more about me being certain about what's certain about that said to me.
As you say, on that, there is, of course, any water-compatible use is going to pass the exception test in any event. So it does beg the question as to whether or not one would need to carry out a sequential test for any relevant purpose, because certainly it wouldn't lead to any different conclusion ultimately. But we will certainly check the position.
Sport England have referred to the loss of the golf course and whether this has been justified through a playing pitch strategy. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that.
Again, something we need to check on, please, sir. Thank you.
My colleague just informed me the playing pitch strategy is a piece of work that's currently underway, and we're expecting findings. Sorry?
So can we, rather than give you partial information at this stage, can we come back on that? So once we have the final position, please.
Fine. Just to point in, just to raise a flag, if you're going to tell me that the playing pitch strategy is something that's being prepared, Mr. Reid is going to understand why.
Yeah, it's exactly why I was wanting to make sure that we had a final position for.
Yeah, and also because it's what was in the plan, what was submitted, so why it was justified. General terms, Sport England raises a lot about a lot of things, so yeah. And in relation to the golf course, again, I suppose the question is, does the application include any expectation in terms of the loss or replacement of the golf course? I think that's probably going back to is it? So is it? We don't know. There's no expectation if the golf course was to be part of the development process that you'd have to replace it elsewhere.
That's not a requirement in the policy.
So if just in general terms, if we lift ourselves up and look at the plan as a whole, if some of this site is identified, and bearing in mind that there's an expectation that the suitability, as it's submitted, you have not carried out an assessment of open space, you've not carried out an assessment of greenbelt zone because you're waiting to see what the applications are. So that would logically follow then that the general open space policies, as set out in the framework, would come into question. So if an application comes in which results in loss of public accessible open space, you would need to carry out the three. I think there's three tests, isn't there? Is it surplus to requirements? Is it being replaced? Is it so on and so forth? So that would be an expectation as well. It's not just about national policy in terms of greenbelt, it's national policy in terms of open space as well.
Absolutely, sir. That's right.
And that might be, again, something we might need to think about being explicit about. There's a few musts and shoulds again, which I think I'll just read them in the kind of what you said earlier, and if I think maybe when I'm looking at this, a should ought to be a must. If there's something that really jumps out at me, I'll tell you. But otherwise, again, just a matter of principle. If you are content for me to go away and think about that and give you some advice later on.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you.
And again, we've got a similar point in the development, because my first question was about scale and density, and I think the same point really. None of the policy refers to the scale of development. And your statement says the scale and density of development is proposed is modest. Well, again, I'll say, well, how can you say that when the plan doesn't say the scale of built development is modest. The site area is 57 hectares, which is not modest. It's a pretty sizable area. As far as I can tell, say none of the requirements set out in table 182 or relevant policies that say set out any control on scale. So it's not right to say. Well, again, if the expectation is the built form is to be modest, then is that something that ought to be set out in the policy? Then that's what you're actually seeking to achieve.
I think it's certainly possible that, given the land use requirements, it's possible that the scale of development could be modest or indeed greater, and that in either eventuality that would be controlled effectively by the infrastructure requirements and design principles.
Yeah, just a word on. Obviously, when you write something in a statement, that's before me. So if you say that the development is proposed is modest, then that's what I'm going to expect to be, rather than then told, well, it might not be actually. It might be more significant. It makes it difficult for me to understand what's coming forward.
I think the point is it's a similar issue as to what you identified with regard to Whitewebbs, that it actually is looking at the capability of it rather than specific forms of development.
Yeah. So yeah. Criterion F does actually refer to openness. This is, I think, the only place it does. So it is a reference to openness in Criterion F, but it does talk about sense of openness and views. And I think, again, we don't want to. I think it's an important distinction in openness between. There is a visual element, as we know from the courts, but there is a spatial element. And I think if you are contemplating that this is your approach, if you like, to saying how you want openness to be addressed, it probably needs to be expressed in a way that's
say visual.
Yeah.
Should probably say visual openness.
I think because openness has a meaning. I get the sense that what you're really saying is not about greenbelt. I don't get the sense that F's about greenbelt openness. No. I think you're just saying this is the character.
Yes.
Which is fine, but it shouldn't be conflated with. Or we don't want your decision makers to conflate those two meanings. So I think.
Understood. Absolutely, sir. Understood.
Covered the practical difference between infrastructure requirements. Yeah, I mean, actually, the point was made earlier. I picked it up perhaps more in this case than I did with Whitewebbs, but there's a few of the musts and shoulds talk about enhancements in terms of transport and landscaping. Landscaping, I'm probably less wary of because that's about what is suitable form of development. But obviously, when it comes to things like transport improvements, that's probably where there is an expectation. But when you don't know what the scale of development is going to be, whether or not you can expect some of those transport improvements to be delivered is perhaps more questionable. So is that a form of wording there to be clear that there's no expectation? Yeah. It kind of goes without saying because the law means you can't require things which are outside the scope of SIL regs, but often it is made clear in policy, so there's no expectation that you're going beyond SIL regs. So I don't know if that's something to think about as well.
See that point, sir. You're certainly in terms of the TfL modifications, TfL agreed modification.
That's probably also going to be something that comes up pretty much. So we'll get. Criterion B, I've touched on it, but it's to talk about in collaboration. The last sentence, it must be demonstrated that this cannot be achieved, and that's about connections. Must be demonstrated that if this cannot be achieved. If this cannot be achieved, I'm not sure I understand that sentence. It must be demonstrated that this cannot be achieved with other public benefits offered instead if this is not proposed. I don't know what you're getting at.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's a very poorly worded sentence. I think the intention of that is that if the specific connection referred to in design principle B can't be achieved,
Other public benefits need to be offered instead.
Yeah. Okay. Such as?
Well, the intention of that is to improve east-west connectivity. So if that specific form of infrastructure couldn't be secured, then I would imagine that alternative forms of interventions that would improve connectivity would be required instead.
Okay. I think you went. Annette's looming because you didn't have your microphone on. Thank you. Okay. Under criterion E, it should retain as many of the existing high-value trees on site as possible and/or replace trees removed as part of a comprehensive landscaping strategy. Is it therefore acceptable in principle for high-value trees to be removed? Policy does imply that mitigation is acceptable alternative. So is that actually consistent with your policies on trees, but also national policy on trees and biodiversity?
Well, I think that would be, well, any approach to trees would have to form part of a comprehensive landscaping strategy. So any specific interventions with regard to individual trees would be assessed as part of that.
But in essence, though, the policy is saying that high-value trees can be removed. It's not saying must retain high-value trees; it should. So, is that what national policy would say about high-value trees in biodiversity terms, if nothing else?
I think the specifics of any landscaping strategy would kind of take into account the characteristics of the individual trees on site, and then it would seek, in terms of the wording of the policy as presently drafted, to retain as much of those as possible.
And does there come a point, sorry, Mr. Reid, does there come a point at which it's not acceptable then? Again, because the policy is, presumably, thou shalt not do unacceptable harm in relation to trees. That's actually what you're trying to get at, isn't it? It's not. That's what your other policies on trees will say.
Yeah, I think that what the council isn't seeking to do is imply that there can be the removal of high-value trees to any extent. It's obviously looking to protect them, and it may be sensible, rather than to have for that to be protected under the general policies of the plan, if there's any ambiguity around that issue, because then it will just have to be justified under those policies. In short, this isn't seeking to provide any exception from those general policies, at least as I understand the position.
And that's a useful point, I think, because again, that's how sometimes site-specific policies can be read.
Yes, quite so.
And that's perhaps actually how they should be. You know, that's because that's a useful reason for an allocation to have these sorts of policies. And it would be, as I think one of your colleagues has again told me, that in areas where there would be a conflict or a tension,
exactly,
you would tend to look at the site-specific rather than generic. So I think if there's if that's not the intention, then I think the site-specific do need to be very clear that there's no exceptions being applied.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Similar point on criterion F, must respond to, no, that's not criterion F. Yes, sorry, must retain the existing sense of openness. Good, very clear. Should respond sensitively to important views. We've had this discussion about whether that form of words is actually is effective or not. Again, you've got all the policies in the plan which say that development must have regard to important views. So, should being treated, is this an exception because it's an allocation, or is it simply trying to reflect those generic policies in a slightly different wording?
Yeah, it's intended to reflect general policies and not to weaken them.
Okay, thank you. By the time we're on site 100, I imagine I won't be picking out some of these out. And I think the main modifications, sorry, that's all I had in terms of some of the specifics. In terms of the main mods, we're in the same boat. I think they are all relating to TfL. And mainly, again, in terms of some of this, I don't think 1 and 2, because they are modifications to what you've already got in the infrastructure requirements, they are seeking to strengthen those, aren't they? So it's not changing the intent, but it is going from a should to a must. And I think that's, again, if you like, fitted into something we've already been talking about, should and must, and so there's that. The new criterion 4. And I'm saying this now all in context of what you told me, Mr. Reid, about the purpose of these, but I'm going to talk about them anyway. Criterion 4, this comes up quite a few times, so we'll try and deal with it now. Must engage with Transport for London and other stakeholders to ensure that transport improvements are effectively integrated into local and regional transport strategies. To me, that's not a development management policy, and it's not for the applicant to be engaging. Well, obviously, they should engage as part of what they would do, but it's clearly, again, I would argue anyway, that the policy is development should be integrated into local transport regional strategies, or complement, or not prejudice, or whatever it is the outcome. But engagement is not a policy. Engagement is a process and shouldn't be there. So whatever conclusion I come onto that form of words, it's not going to be that. I don't know if you've got any view.
And it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
No, quite so. And it's unnecessary in any event, because you could cross out engage through to stakeholders and still have the same policy imperative. No, I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Is that all of that? I think that's all of them on there, isn't it? Oh, and then you have suggested a modification on the inset maps. I don't think I've got those, so at some point you'll obviously produce those, and I'll have to look at them and see whether, again, they're minor additional modifications or not. Just as a matter of principle, if I want to see the site, I'm obviously coming to any points, but if I want to see the site, is it again fairly? It sounds like it would be fairly accessible in general sense.
The answer is yes, but it's not publicly accessible. So you can go. There is the golf course there. You can go to the cabin and explain to them who you are,
right? Okay.
And they will direct you. And
okay.
But it's not. Yeah, it's if you turn up, someone will say to you, "Excuse me, sir, this is private."
Okay, fair enough.
So
fair
just
enough.
heads up, give them a heads up.
But in terms of the obviously presumably the cinema and all that areas.
Cinema.
Yeah.
The
so would I from the public domain?
Yes.
Is all aspects of it? If I stand on the edge of the car park, can I see?
Yes, 100%.
Pretty much everyone.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so any points you want to raise about the development requirements? And I mean, I know you're supportive of the principle, so I don't suppose you have to worry too much about it, but any points on the requirements?
No, and thank you for picking up some of the points. I hadn't quite realised some of the differences, so that's helpful. In terms of accessing the site, if you wanted to contact the Regional Park Authority or myself, we can make the arrangements, and then you can view the site as you see fit.
Okay.
Because you might need to walk around the golf course, I would think, to fully appreciate the extent of the site.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't make this point my opening that my preference is obviously to site visits unaccompanied.
Yeah. No,
if they are on private land, then tends to be they have to be accompanied. That would be the council, site promoter, and anybody else who wishes to, subject to the landowner being content with that. In appeals, we have something called access required visits, where inspectors can be given access. We don't tend to do that in local plans, so it's something I'll have to think about. If I go and see what I need to see, and if I feel there's any more I need to do, then I'll probably take it up there. But thank you for the offer, and I'll bear that in mind. Thank you. Are you happy with, content, I should say, with any other points you want to raise on these?
No, and I think we've covered. I've said the bits I wanted to say, so that's good.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. Are we happy? Yeah. So should we carry on with Sloeman?
Yes. Thank you.
I think again very much be similar. We're going to be ticking off some of those points we've already raised. And thank you if you want to go. Then thank you very much for your contributions. They're very much appreciated. We'll try and finish. We're going slightly over time, but we'll try and finish this as quickly as possible. So, in terms of the green belt, I think it's saying that this is not quite the same as some of the others in terms of obviously burial uses. It's the same principle in terms of buildings, facilities associated with buildings still in the same category.
Yes.
But I understand, obviously, just in basic understanding of what these places are like, that the scale of development is likely to be of a different order. So, and the scale, facilities are likely to be a different order. So, I understand that. But it's the same principles still apply, and I'll be looking at the policies.
Yes.
In light of what I've said. Just a note, again, it's a note really. I know there is an application in. It doesn't sound, again, it's not particularly interested in the application, but I think in your statement you've sort of try to provide some comfort that, you know, everything's everything can be achieved and there's no problem because this application's dealing with all that, and that's obviously not for me. But I did just want to, again, sorry, I'm such a pedant, but in the statement you talk about, well, it's quite single story and sits low in the landscape and therefore doesn't have a very big visual impact building. But of course, again, just going back to what I said, that the visual impact and openness is one thing, the spatial impact and openness is a different thing. So I don't think that paragraph necessarily covers, gives total comfort on that, but I understand and I've got that, but probably don't need to labour that anymore. And I think some of the other, practically every other greenbelt issue I've got is the same as what we've talked about. So again, if you're comfortable with me taking all that away and reporting in due course or feeding back in due course, that's fine.
Absolutely. Said one thing we did say within our response was that there was the aim of minimising the visual and spatial impact. So we had it in mind, but we could have certainly indicated it perhaps more forcefully.
I think a lot of this would be probably a bit, some of this at least, matters of principle notwithstanding, that if the sites are sound in principle, what changes, if any, need to be made to the criteria to make some of these points that you've not like making things up, but these things you've said you're expecting, to actually make that clear. That's what you're expecting. Any points on the greenbelt side of things?
Well, just to point out that the site does lie in the Enfield Chase area of special character, and therefore, as far as the Enfield Society is concerned, it is a very sensitive space. It's greenbelt, but it's greenbelt plus.
Okay. So Enfield Chase area of special character, isn't it?
That's right. Yes.
And that, I think, speaks to moving on to the next point. Anyway, about is it justified in general terms? If it's in an area of sensitivity. So, to what extent is that being assessed, or the policy is mindful of that sensitivity?
So we attempted to address that, as well as through national policy requirements, which we've discussed, through the specific design principles. So it talks about the design principle A, talks about maintaining the existing rural character. And then there are other policies in the plan that would also apply. So policy DE11, which talks about landscape character, and especially the context of the AOSC.
And is it a case that being in the AOSC effectively stymies development, or is it in principle, or is it something that can be and presumably is addressed?
Yeah, it's certainly not a blocker on all forms of development, but it's a consideration to be borne in mind for decision makers and those conceiving development proposals.
Thank you. I think I've got similar points about the flood risk. I think it's a similar thing that the topic paper identifies this as being 2 and 3, and the plan says 1. I think you'll come back to me on that. In terms of development requirements, some of this, again, is already picked up in terms of greenbelt issues, but also some of the shoulds and musts, and scale and density of use as well. Criterion C talks about promoting, etc. So the first part is must promote nature recovery. Fine. The last sentence is proposals that offer greater levels of biodiversity net gain than minimum requirements will be encouraged. That's a new form of words. I think that's not in the other two similar policies. We haven't got to it, whether that appears everywhere else. But is that, bearing in mind what, and we'll come on at some point to your BNG policies and what national policy has to say about that, but is it justified, except you're not requiring it, but you're encouraging it, but I guess why here? What's the purpose of saying that here and not everywhere else? Because surely that would apply anywhere, wouldn't it?
Well, it sets a positive requirement, and I think it's important with proposals for natural burial. I mean, that seems manifestly possible that they could. I guess that kind of land use and that activity could generate real biodiversity gains, and we thought it'd be worth flagging that in policy at the outset to make it clear to those conceiving of development proposals that that's an aim that the council would wholeheartedly support.
Mm. But if it doesn't, then obviously the policy doesn't say if you don't do that, you only meet basic policy requirements. It's not a determinative factor. Are you saying that you would give more? So in terms of planning balance, if it comes forward with a greater level of BNG or nature recovery, that would be added bonus in the planning balance.
It would be a bonus in the planning balance, and then if they didn't come up with levels of biodiversity greater than that required by the plan as a whole, then that would be a fallback position. So, yeah.
It'd be neutral, because presumably if you wouldn't be a negative, would it? Because you're meeting the policy requirements and legal requirements. Okay. One might argue it goes without saying. So whether it's necessary to be there or not, I don't know, but.
I think it was probably, as Dr. Jones has indicated, I think probably what it was seeking to do was, because of its ability to be provided on site, it would be an effective part of the policy for that to be directed towards.
Okay. The heritage considerations in the table do talk about locally listed landscape, which I guess is the area of special Enfield Chase area of special landscape priority, and wider setting of additional heritage assets, including but not limited to a group of Grade 2 listed buildings to the east. Don't think, unless you're going to point something I've missed, the policy really says anything about that, unless you're saying that's what E is talking about when it refers to relationship with existing properties, which I would have taken as being a more generic point about the amenity of all existing buildings rather than a heritage point. So I guess in line, again, this is where we get into the, if you're saying this about heritage in one policy, should you be saying it about it in others where there's similar characteristics, because then it will obviously give rise to concerns that you're not giving heritage the same weight here as you would be elsewhere, even though they all fall back to national policy.
Yes, I agree. I think it's, in terms of conceiving of development proposals, reading the site allocation as drafted, I think flagging the heritage considerations up front, that would kind of put it on the radar of a developer. But yeah, I take the point that the reference to existing rural character in design principle A could be strengthened or maybe expanded to consider the historic environment more broadly.
Well, it's just in other policies you've said words to the effect, must seek to respond positively or whatever words are used to existing heritage assets. Where there are some here in the area. Again, yes, I accept that statutory, if they've got statutory protection, whether it's listed, whether it's referred to in the policy or not, there's a requirement for you to have regard to that. But if it's mentioned in some and not others, then it's bound to raise the question: are you not as concerned? Okay, thank you. And I think that's what I mean. It's not as much on this, I don't think. Again, similar points apply. There'll be similar points about whether some of the transport requirements would be still compliant, but that might be something that's just caught in a catch-all somewhere. I don't know. And obviously all the generic points. I note there are no modifications to the policy here suggested, so obviously probably not as many concerns from TfL about the location. The only mod is the amend to inset map to show the site remaining in the green belt, because I think I did raise that as a preliminary point. So you clarified that it should be in the green belt, so that's fine. So. Yeah, I had a small point, I think, about how the modifications referred to in the hearing statement, but it amounts to nothing of note. And I'm not worried about the delivery, particularly. Obviously, no requirement. I asked the question, but there's no requirement to deliver this in a particular time frame to meet any, so I've got no particular concerns there. Any points about the development requirements? I mean, or anything else for that matter?
Well, I've got a few observations, if I could just quickly run through them. And I think we're going to be in the situation we were with RUR 07 to some extent, but I'll adapt my points accordingly. The first thing I was going to say is that in your letter IN7 after stage 1, you made some comments about these 3 sites that we've been looking at today, and the council have proposed some modifications to policy CL4 and PL9 to try and address some of your concerns, as I understood it anyway. And that was around NPPF 154B, which is to do with the openness of the Greenbelt area when these kinds of permitted developments take place. But I noticed that the council have used different wording for PL9, which I suspect applies to this site, than the wording that was suggested for RUR 6 and 7. In those particular cases, CL4 policy, they made an explicit reference to that NPPF paragraph, but that's not the case with the one for PL9. I'm not quite sure why that difference has occurred. I'm sure we can get an answer for that, though. What our main concern is with Sloeman's Farm is not the principle of it being used for burial. We don't have a problem with that. It's the potential for an unsympathetic proposal that might come forward. And of course, as we know, one has now been lodged by the council on the 5th of July, which of course happened after Reg 19. The council made a number of references to their planning application in their hearing statement, paragraph 491, paragraph 470. I won't repeat the points because we're not looking at that particular planning application as you've confirmed today. But the point is that those statements seem to underline how this planning application does conform to the policy. The Enfield Society take a different view. I'm not going to give the objections to that because it's not appropriate. What I would say about this, a number of two points I would make. First of all, the design principle F, which is about the vehicular access on Whitewebbs Road, and also design principle A, which talks about the rural character of Whitewebbs Road being maintained. Our concern there is that an inappropriate entrance might be proposed, and we can look at the one that's been created a bit further along that road to the entrance to the Spurs Football Club, and that would be totally something that we would be against if that was replicated at this site. Incidentally, the planning application has no information about the entrance. I checked it this morning before coming here. The other area that we've got a concern is on the building itself. I'm not going to pass any comment about the size of the building, but the land rises from Whitewebbs Road, and therefore the building has to be very carefully constructed to not be visible. I don't think there's sufficient information at the moment for us to draw an opinion about that, but it is on rising ground, and therefore it will be difficult to make that blend into that sensitive landscape. I would also draw your attention, sir, to our Stage 1 Matter 4 hearing statement, pages 7 to 10, where we did go into some more details about this particular area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, thanks. I've not picked up in massive detail the changes that are proposed for CL4 and PL9 for two reasons. One is, as I already told the council, I'm not currently convinced about them, and there may well be some further advice given on this at some point. But obviously, we'll have when we get into those two policies, we'll be talking about those anyway, in light of some of these discussions. It is a fair point about the difference in wording, something I would want to pick up, but one of the things that I would be saying to the council is don't refer to specific policies of the framework because they'll change, and then we're into and possibly already have. So
I heard your earlier comment about that, but I felt it was important that I made that point.
Clearly, yeah, I think my comment on those would be, well, put a pin in those, because I'm once I've reflected on all of this, that will inevitably have a knock-on to those two policies, I imagine, and therefore we'll see where that takes us. Thank you for that. I get the impression, potentially, I mean, you've come across with it, obviously, as often is the case, it might be that you're relatively content with the wording of some of these criteria, but the implementation might be a different thing. But would you, in front of what you've said about the landscape sensitivity, in that criterion A talks about existing rural character, and criterion F talk about access, except those things it could have an effect on Whitewebbs. But are you suggesting that the policy itself and the criteria don't say enough about siting of buildings in terms of, or scale of buildings in terms of the effect on the landscape, and it could say more about that?
Potentially, yes, I suppose it could. I mean, we do notice that one of the other criteria, design principles, was G, which is about the siting of them being close to the main vehicular access, which I interpret to be Whitewebbs Road. Yeah.
And is that where again, I'll see this when I go and look, is that where you say that it rises there and were there before?
Well, if you look at the site topology, which I don't think, I haven't seen it anywhere in the local plan, but it is in the planning application, it is pretty much rises completely almost to the M25, okay. And then it dips down slightly just before that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anything you want to come back on?
Thank you very much.
I think they are all points I need to... again, once I've been on site, I can obviously reflect on what you've said, and again, it will give me a view as to whether I think the policy is effective or not. I mean, that's...
No, thank you. Nothing from us. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. Is there anything else anyone wishes to say before I draw today's discussions to an end? No. Thank you all for a long day. I do apologise for slightly misjudging the session.
Sitting to make sure we get through it.
Yes, okay. And we will adjourn now and return at 9:30 tomorrow morning for Hadley Wood. Sorry, yes, indeed. Slightly concerned, Mr. Reid, that you might have been implying you didn't think we'd get through that tomorrow. But was
sorry. That I was implying we wouldn't get through that. No. In no way was I suggesting that. I think we are very well able to get through.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you all.